debate tonight. Another three-way. We've got capitalist versus socialist versus communist. We've got Dan, Brenton, and Caleb. So what we're going to do is we're going to start off by giving each of these guys 5 minutes to open up as the just an opening to give a brief description of themselves, what their position is, kind of lay out where they're coming from. Then we'll have a 5 minute rebuttal for each person in order to kind of contend with some of the things they've heard, interact with some of the material that the other contenders have said, and then we will do an open dialogue for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have a Q&A. So with that, I just want to say thanks to everybody for showing up. Make sure and hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. And at Modern Day Debate, we just like to make sure that everybody feels welcome here. It doesn't matter your background or your creed or anything like that. We're all just wanting to further this conversation and find out where all the good ideas are and try to sift the rational or the reasonable from the unreasonable. So with that, I guess we'll go ahead and start with Dan. Dan, why don't you give your 5 minute opening?
Awesome. Thank you very much, Converse, for having me here today. Thank you, everybody who's joining us on YouTube. My name is Dan Fishman. I am the executive director of the Libertarian Party. We are the third largest party in the United States. And we work towards personal liberty. We stand for the idea that on most issues, right and left is just an illusion. The Republicans and the Democrats want you to believe that politics is a number line, and that to the right, camera right, to the right is the Republican Party, and beyond that are corporations controlling everything. To the left are the Democrats, and beyond that is the state controlling everything. Libertarians will tell you that number line is not true. Right and left is fake. What's really true is up and down, authoritarian and freedom. Politics is not two-dimensional, it's three-dimensional. That third dimension, that third direction, the direction is up. That's the direction of personal liberty. Cannabis is not a right issue or a left issue, it's an up issue. Marriage equality is not a right issue or a left issue, it's an up issue. I'm here to argue for capitalism because capitalism is the ultimate up issue. Capitalism has raised us up. If you look at the standard of living in the United States today, almost everybody has a standard of living that is well beyond what kings and queens had 200 years ago. Hot and cold running water, electricity in your house, flat screen televisions, all these amazing things that we have because of capitalism. Friedrich Hayek was a libertarian philosopher, wrote a book called The Fatal Conceit. And in it, he talked about the fact that if you look at our amazing world, right here on my cell phone, I have the sum of all human knowledge available to me. I can get pineapple in Maryland in the middle of winter. There's not a pineapple tree within 1,000 miles of here. I can call right now and a car will come and pick me up and take me where I want to go. All these amazing things are available. They're available because of capitalism. They're available because of the failures and successes in a modern business world. In a place where there is not competition, where 1 million people aren't trying to find a service that they can be paid for, you don't get advancements like that. Right now, if you want to be a millionaire in the United States, all you have to do is figure out what is a service that you can provide to people that they will pay for, and you'll be a millionaire. Now, the problem with that, of course, is that it doesn't work for most people. That's what makes our plan work, is that it's the competition of everybody else. Because you never know which idea is going to succeed, which idea is going to fail. We don't really know that. And the idea that anybody can know that any planned economy could know that, that's laughable. Everybody's online, so you can look up this really easy thing called the Kingsbury Commitment. What's the Kingsbury Commitment? The Kingsbury Commitment is an agreement that the government and AT&T signed in 1913, giving AT&T a monopoly over phones. Now, most of you guys are too young to remember this, but if you ask your parents, they will remember a period when it was illegal to own a telephone in the United States. That was true in 1970. In 1970, it was illegal for you to own your own telephone. Why did that change? Changed because in 1980, AT&T said this stranglehold, the government granted monopoly, is actually killing us. Monopolies are bad for business. We're not incented to really work hard. We want the monopoly to end. The government said, okay, we'll break you up, AT&T, and they did. They broke them up into Sprint, into MCI, WorldCom, Verizon, T-Mobile, all these other companies that now compete. And if you ask your grandparents, telephones didn't change between 1920 and 1980. They were essentially the exact same phone. You think how much phones have changed between 1980 and 2010, 2020, that's capitalism for you. And it's unintended consequences, right? Nobody knew when the cell phone came around that the cell phone would be the greatest tool ever invented for criminal justice reform. But the fact of the matter is, what brings more police to justice now? What stops more abuse of the system? Cell phones and citizens. That's the change that really makes a difference for us. Capitalism has all sorts of unintended consequences. And the point of it is, we can't know what's going to happen. And if we tried to know, we wouldn't be able to determine what's a winner and what's a loser. The only thing that gives us this remarkable success is everybody trying to succeed at once, and the winner being chosen by all the people who say, this one fits my needs, that one fits your needs. There's room for competition, as opposed to a one-size-fit-all. Capitalism, at times, leaves people behind. I'll wrap it up.
No, sir.
At times, leaves some people behind because they're going to be winners and they're going to be losers in the market. But it is the fastest way to enable our civilization to provide the best for everybody.
All right, thanks so much for that opening. It looks like we got Brenton back. Brenton, why don't you go ahead with your 5-minute opening?
Sure. You can hear me, right?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So my name is Brenton Lengel. I am a writer, journalist, sometimes activist. Did a lot with Occupy Wall Street, which is where I met Caleb, who I still consider one of my good friends and one of the smartest people that I know. And I also ran into Dan online and have been following him for quite a while. And I was not able to vote for you, Dan, but I probably would have, or at least I shared your campaign, though I disagree with a lot of your ideas. Not all of them, but a lot of them. So I am what you might call a libertarian socialist, is the best description. On my best days, you know, where I feel the most hopeful, you might consider me something in the realm of a democratic socialist, but usually I'm tend to be much more radical than that. My school of thought, the school of thought that I most associate with, is libertarian socialism / anarcho-communism from the Spanish tradition. Basically, what this would come down to, the way this would be contrasted with what most people think of when they think of like big C communism or socialism, is I favor a stateless, propertyless, moneyless society where the means of production, which is to say the large vital industry, are controlled, are owned arguably by everyone, and controlled and operated by the people that work within them democratically for the benefit of themselves and the society as a whole. If you want to know what my single guiding principle is as a libertarian socialist, it would be that power corrupts. And as power corrupts, the most important thing that we can do is keep power out of the hands of individuals to a certain extent. I don't want no one to be powerful, but I want everyone to be as equally powerful as possible. So one of the major thinkers in libertarian socialist tradition is Michaela, who very famously said, freedom without socialism is inequality and tyranny. Socialism without freedom is slavery and brutality. So really what I'm looking to do, if we want to take this as a metaphor here, think of a power vacuum. Because when a government collapses, when a society is not able to do the things that it needs to do, something has to fill that power vacuum. Now, traditionally, human society has filled that power vacuum with several large boulders, or in the case of an absolute monarch or a dictator, one big boulder, one person. What I would like to do is to take that power, smash it up into grains of sand, and plug that vacuum with 1,000 tiny pebbles. So what I'm looking to get us into is, for the Americans who are listening, think of a society where separation of powers is taken seriously, not simply between branches of government, but between human beings, where we must collaborate and work together democratically to make sure that we live in the most just and harmonious society possible. Now, that's a lot of big pie in the sky stuff, but to bring that down to a level that the average person can understand what I'm for, I am for a reduction in any kind of power that I see, be it economic, political, or if possible, charismatic. That's the hardest thing to get. I am for the democratic reorganization of society from below, where each person is contributing equally with every other person, and we continue to take care of each other in such a sense that, to actually fulfill the promise of I am my brother's keeper. Because if we play the capitalist game, if we play the game of competition, I'm sorry, there are just a few winners and a lot of losers. And anytime you put me in a room and you say, hey, hit this button and you'll never be rich, but you'll always have what you need, I'm going to hit that button in a second. So that's my position there, and we can get more into detail with it, but I hope that lets you kind of know who I am and what I'm about. The biggest thing that I'd say is that, the first place I encountered an anarchist society was when I was hiking the Appalachian Trail, Maine to Georgia. The thru hiker community functioned on a economy that was essentially random acts of kindness from strangers. And you would think that that'd be very terrifying. And when I first went out there, I remember I carried a big knife with me, and I was really worried because I'd be deep in the woods, no police, anything can happen. And I found that what I found there completely rejuvenated my faith in humanity and our ability to organize without strong coercive power structures. So that's what I've got, and we can get into that more deeply as we continue.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Brenton. Now, Caleb, you want to go ahead and give your 5-minute opening?
Sure. Well, I want to say hello to my friend Brent, who I did meet at Occupy Wall Street. Always a pleasure to hang out with you, and I'm really glad to meet my libertarian opponent as well, and I think we can have a very civil discussion, and I look forward to it. I want to say that I am primarily motivated in my beliefs in advocating 21st century socialism and wanting to continue the tradition that began with Marx and Engels and continued with Lenin and continues up to this day with China, with the Bolivarian countries, and with many efforts to build an alternative to capitalism around the world. I'm primarily motivated by patriotism. I love my country, and I'm worried about the future of my country because huge multinational corporations are doing to the United States at this very hour the same thing that they've been doing to people in Asia, in Africa, in Latin America for centuries. We are living under a dictatorship by billionaires and bankers who do not care about the future of the people in this country or the future of the people in any other country. They are only concerned about their profits. And I would say that what we need is a government of action that will fight for working families. We need an economy that is organized to serve public good and not profits, and that capitalism was a great advance over feudalism, and feudalism was a great advance over the slave economies of ancient Rome, Greece, and Egypt, and the slave economies of ancient, Rome, Greece, and Egypt was a great advance over primitive communalism and tribalism. History is like a train speeding forward. And capitalism has had great advances. However, capitalism is a naturally unstable system. In systems of the past, people were hungry because there wasn't enough food, right? There were food shortages, people starved. Only under capitalism do we have a system where people starve because there is too much food. And let me add that, in systems of the past, people were homeless because there was a shortage of housing. But only in capitalism do people become homeless because there is too much housing. The capitalist system is highly irrational. And on top of that, when you have great technological leaps and advances and the ability to produce products becomes more and more efficient than ever, you get poverty alongside of it because abundance creates poverty, because the worker under capitalism, his value is only his ability to sell his labor power. And the more efficient technology becomes, the fewer people are hired. And Andrew Yang, I don't agree with his solution of universal basic income, but he ran a great presidential campaign talking about the fact that automation is hanging over our heads. We are producing iPhones and iPads and technology more efficiently than ever before in history. And it's not leading to more prosperity and abundance. It's leading to a global crisis of capitalism. Because at the end of the day, the worker is also the consumer, and we cannot afford to buy back what we, the workers, are producing. This is a naturally unstable system, and it calls for human reason to control the major centers of economic power. Banking should be controlled by the state. Natural resources should be run by the state. Major industries should be run by the state. But I also don't believe we should have a totally government-run economy. I don't think the government should run hotels. I don't think the government should run restaurants. But the things that are essential for ensuring economic stability and continuing economic growth, these things are things that should be rationally controlled by humans, not left to the anarchy of production or the chaos of the market. And that's why I consider myself to be a 21st century socialist, a Marxist, continuing the great traditions. Let me add that all debates around this topic in the United States are pretty much premised on a lie. They are premised on the notion that socialism has failed everywhere it's ever been tried. It's never had a single success. That's something that is completely and utterly false. It was socialism that invented space travel. It was socialism that took Russia from being one of the most impoverished agrarian countries to being an industrial superpower. It was socialism that has made China, at this point, the second largest economy in the world. It's socialism that's the reason that a tiny island in the Caribbean called Cuba is loved all over the world and studied all over the world for the achievements of its healthcare system. There have been horrendous problems and difficulties. Most socialist countries have maintained a very authoritarian political system. You know, there's many things you can criticize. But the claim that we frequently hear in the United States that communism, socialism has never achieved anything is just a big, fat lie. There has been huge economic successes due to central planning and socialist economic development. And as long as that lie continues to be the premise on which debates continue in the United States, we're never going to get ahead. We need a government of action that will fight for working families, that will change our relationship with countries around the world so that we're trading on the basis of win-win cooperation, getting wealthier as we make other countries wealthier instead of a win-win global system. We need a government of action that will fight for working families. We need an economy that is organized to serve public good and not profits. And that's why I continue to uphold the tradition of Marx, Lenin, while, you know, looking back at the mistakes and looking at the achievements that are made and seeing things in a scientific way. Marxism is scientific socialism. It's different than the utopian and religious socialism that came before. It's rooted in an understanding of how the world works, how economics works, and how we can build a better life for everyone. And the ultimate goal, which I think is pretty much the same goal as everyone on this panel, is a world with so much material abundance and so much prosperity that a maximum amount of freedom can be created. I think the libertarians want that. I think the anarcho-communists and socialists want that. We want a world with so much abundance and so much prosperity that the need for a state, the need for coercion can fade away. I think that's a very admirable goal, but the only way to get there is to organize the economy rationally and get profits out of command and put human reason in control.
All right. Thanks so much for that interesting opening, Caleb. We're going to move back to Dan for a 5-minute rebuttal just to kind of respond to some of the things he's heard, and then we'll move into open conversation after everybody gets a rebuttal. Go ahead, Dan.
Thanks, Bruce, and thanks very much, Brenton and Caleb, for your considered opinions. A couple things that I would talk about. You know, Brent talked about being on the Appalachian Trail, and awesome. They didn't need police. You know, it was this great communal feeling. That's absence of government. That is actually the opposite of what we're advocating for, because the presence of government implies the presence of force. Laws require law enforcement, which injects force into our society. And one of the things that Caleb had talked about, he said, you know, we have this advancement of society, and each one was an improvement over the other. But he talked about the slave society of the Romans being an improvement over tribalism, and I would disagree with that. I think that slavery is always terrible. It's not something that we should ever condone. Even slavery for a good reason, because your good reason never outweighs the need for an individual person to have their liberty. Slave system, fundamentally, where you are not in control of your own destiny, that's bad for you. And there is no other person who is more important than you. The individual is the ultimate minority. And we should always stand up for the rights of the minority, okay? The minority should never have their needs suppressed. There may be a situation where one person is doing something that's so terrible that everybody in the community needs to say, we got to stop that person. Maybe that person's a murderer. They're using force against somebody else. In that space, the community is entitled to act against somebody who is aggressing against the community. But if somebody is not hurting anybody else, and I mean directly hurting them, you don't get a right to take their liberty away. You are not endowed by your creator with any special rights that are different from anybody else's. So everybody else has the right to pursue liberty. We talked about the idea, Caleb talked about the idea that we all want in a world with so much abundance that we have unlimited liberty. Libertarians actually believe the opposite of that. We need to have the liberty to create the abundance, because absent liberty, your life is not sweet. You know, if you live in a gilded cage, it's not worth it. Maya Angelou's got it right? We know why the caged bird sings. The caged bird sings of freedom. Fundamentally, those are our core beliefs that we have to talk about. And when Caleb talks about he wants to see banking controlled by the state, I think that's a terrible idea. Fundamentally, if I have a business idea and the state doesn't think it's good, but I can find a personal person to invest in me, I ought to be able to do that. There are banks that make money by taking riskier loans, charging a higher interest rate, but that's on me. If I have a high risk idea, but I believe in myself, I might take a loan that's at a higher rate than the state would offer me. It's important that we have freedom of currency, freedom of banking, freedom of competition in all these things. When the state controls these things, it's a terrible thing. And, you know, I do agree that Caleb is right. Okay, so socialists sort of did create the space industry, right? But it was the German V2 program. It was National Socialists. They have the first rocket program that's going on. I don't know that that's worth it. I don't think that a society that is built with that sort of authoritarianism is worth the fact that we were able to send rockets outside of the atmosphere for the first time. So I agree with the idea that we're talking about an argument of coercion versus persuasion. The core element between all these different things is that under a libertarian society, under a capitalist society, you personally can be as communistic as you want. You can be as socialistic as you want. You can form your own commune, live according to your own rules. That's freedom. You can do whatever you want. And if your system works, people are going to voluntarily come and join them. You will have persuaded them. However, under a communist system and under a socialist system, I will be coerced. People will stop me from earning as much money as I possibly can. And I want to earn that money because I want to take care of my family. I want to take care of my friends. I want to contribute to the charitable causes that I find incredibly worthwhile. That's what I work hard for. Hey, personally, I don't live as a wealthy person. I have jobs that have earned me a lot of money in the past. I use that money to try to make the world better. And I think that we all want to do that. And we all deserve the ability and the freedom to make the world as best we can in the manner that we see fit. Thank you.
Dan, great timing. All right, thanks so much for that rebuttal. Brenton, you want to give your feedback as well?
Sure. I'm going to be putting my feedback primarily on Caleb and the rebuttal because I was kicked out and I didn't hear his opening statement for Dan.
Yes.
But I've heard a lot of arguments like this. So a couple of things. The first thing I'm going to mention is I will somewhat agree with Dan on the point of Roman slavery and the slavery systems being a improvement over the previous tribal societies. And I get what you're going with that, Caleb, because I think overall building our civilization is a good thing. But there's plenty of evidence that the rise of the state was not actually a good thing for a number of people. You can go as far back as there is archaeological evidence that the people who still lived as hunter-gatherers during the time that the first farming settlements were emerging lived longer lives and were better fed and healthier than the people in the cities. This was when we moved from the pre-state society, the so-called primitive communism, to what we began to see as the rise of the state. This was not a peaceful transition like a lot of people have been led to assume. This was largely a slave economy that grew out of three advances. The first advance was coins. Was the actual use of money. Money existed before this, but not in the previous way that it had. The second was the professional army. which was paid with those silver coins. Those professional armies then would go out, because previously there were armies and there were wars, but what they did was they were wars of plunder. You can't keep a professional standing army just based on what they can run in and steal. So what did these armies do when they sacked various city-states and they brought the mountain tribes and the hill tribes into line? They turned them into slaves. And suddenly you have slaves working in silver mines to mine silver coins, to hand to the military, to then go out and get more slaves. And oh my, I've gone cross-eyed. So, there are a number of wonderful advances that have come with civilization, but there's also a number of things that we've given up. And I'm not making an argument for anarcho-primitivism. I don't think we should go back to primitive pre-state communism because, for one thing, I like the medical advances we have. Both my wife and son would be dead without them. But at the same time, what I would really like to see is I would like to see us get to a place where we are as free as we were in the state of nature, while still enjoying the benefits of civilization without having to give up so much of our souls to what is essentially, a giant machine. And it's not a machine made of, metal. It's not a machine made of electronics. It's a machine made of humans. It is a machine constructed of human relationships, and that is the economic and political system that we live in. Now, I'm going to go over to Dan, though, here. Dan, I would say in like a perfect Pollyanna world where everybody starts out from the same position and everyone has the same advantages and disadvantages from birth, your system of competition would be effective, I think. I really do think, in theory, capitalism sounds very nice. It sounds very nice on paper. But in real life, that's not how these things play out. Not only are we all coming from different backgrounds with different skill sets and different levels of education, different countries, what's also happening, so the system itself is unfair, but as someone gains more and more power, what happens is that they pull to themselves the ability to rewrite the rules as they see fit. Michael Bloomberg is a perfect example, and he got destroyed in the last debate, thank God. But the thing is that he still bought his way up to the same level of support as Elizabeth Warren had after campaigning for over a year. Money is oftentimes a free ride for unqualified people into positions where they should never be and have no business being. Because what money is ultimately, like you said, you want money. And I understand why you want money, because you said it. You want to be able to take care of your family. You want to be able to take care of your friends. You want to be a positive influence on your community. That's a wonderful thing. But you don't actually need money to do that. Money is an intelligence system. It's a way that we created to kind of decide what projects are worthy, what people are smart enough to put our trust in, and it's even possibly considered a check and balance on the system of popular power that is democracy. But at the same time, it's not actually anything. Money is not wealth. It's not real. If you burned up all the money in the world, and what would happen was we would still have all of the productive capabilities. So what we need to do is we need to find a way to collaborate with each other to provide the maximum amount of freedom for the maximum amount of people. And I really don't think that we can find that middle ground in capitalism or necessarily the socialism that Caleb advocates, and we can talk about that later.
All right. Thanks so much for that rebuttal, Brenton, and we'll move to Caleb for the last rebuttal.
Well, we can all agree that slavery is horrendous, but I don't think that slavery came into existence and replaced the primitive tribal system because of anyone's ill will or lack of morality or lack of respect for the rights of others. It came into existence mainly because human beings had developed pointed sticks and rocks and had become hunters, and their ability to hunt was so effective. With our creativity and our brilliance, we became such good hunters, and we were paying attention to how fruits and nuts were growing and the patterns. We became such good hunter-gatherers, and the human population expanded, and there was a scarcity. And out of necessity, we began, having agriculture, domesticating animals, and growing crops. taking land as private property. And that was the origin of a higher social order that came into existence because the older social order was untenable. And yes, there was a huge amount of force involved. And let me add that many people give the impression, right, that the capitalists of this world, the billionaires and the bankers that run this world, they worked for what they have. They worked hard for what they have, and it's a non-aggression system. They earned what they have, and that leftists and socialists, they believe in force and violence and want to forcibly take away what these people have earned with the sweat of their brow. The reality is that capitalism came into existence with a mass episode of extremely violent theft. Read about the clearing of the commons during the Middle Ages, and how people were forced off their land. Read about what was done all across Europe as peasants who had a spot in a feudal estate were forced to become wage laborers, mass executions for homelessness across Europe. Read about the international slave trade, the rosy dawn of capitalism. Read about colonialism that went on. Read about how the land was acquired in the United States by big railroad companies. There's nothing remotely lacking in force about the way capitalism came into existence. It came into existence very violently. And let me add that socialism is simply an effort to organize the economy to serve the people. And this notion that we can have an unregulated market, right, and that we can somehow naturally prevent monopolies from emerging just contradicts the law of the market. As the market proceeds, some companies go out of business, some corporations get bigger, and when one group of people tends to acquire the wealth, they then tend to use their wealth to influence the government to secure their wealth even more. Real capitalism, this is the thing. I always hear, well, it's not capitalism, Caleb. This is crony capitalism. All capitalism is crony capitalism. Whenever wealth concentrates, and I'm talking means of production, I'm talking huge multinational corporations, natural resources, banks, whenever that is acquired in the hands of a small group of people, they tend to then use the government to make sure it stays in their hands and doesn't get taken away from them. All capitalism is crony capitalism, and the modern capitalist state has always existed merely to serve the purpose of making sure that capitalists maintain their wealth, and that the boom-bust cycle under capitalism. This is something that's acknowledged by almost all credible modern economists. The reality of what Karl Marx called it overproduction, John Maynard Keynes called it underconsumption. The fact that the market leads to a situation where you have a glut of products that cannot be sold, workers cannot buy back the products they produced, you have unemployment, and the question is, how do you resolve it? And you brought up Nazi Germany before. Well, in Nazi Germany, the way they resolved it is they created the first military-industrial complex, and they created a system of concentration camps and created the world's first prison-industrial complex. And they created a horrendous state to prop up the big corporations like Krupp and Tyson, and it inevitably led to the Second World War, which was one of the greatest disasters in all history. But let me add that at this point, our economy has been propped up by a military-industrial complex, right? The government spends money. It doesn't give it to people like me. It doesn't give it to working people. It gives it to big military corporations to keep this economy rolling ahead and keep churning out production, because this is a naturally unstable system. And with the threat of automation and the low-wage economy so many young people are facing, we cannot continue this. We need a government that will invest in average people, and making sure people can see a doctor when they're sick, and making sure people have employment, and building roads and building hospitals and building high-speed railway. We cannot afford to maintain letting our country and the global economy be left up to the dictates of whatever is profitable for a huge millionaire, billionaire class. We need a government of action that will fight for the people and organize society rationally. And let me just add one more point before I conclude. The idea that banking should be in the hands of the state, that long predates Karl Marx, right? That's actually in the Bible, right? Every major religion, Christianity, Judaism, and Islam, has forbid the lending of money at interest. And the reason for that is because it leads to a creditor class of people who have money by having money. They lend money at interest and get it back, and pretty soon the governments are in debt to them. Pretty soon all of society is in debt to them, and you have a group of people who created wealth without any actual human labor being involved. When nothing is being created, when wealth is created simply by having other wealth, that leads to a situation where you have a huge gap between the rich and poor, and basically the situation we're in today. So let me add that.
All right. Thanks so much for that interesting rebuttal as well. and we will move into the open discussion. So just a dialogue here. Maybe Dan will start because he was the furthest back to speak. So go ahead, Dan. You're muted.
Thank you. So one of the interesting conversations I think we could have is one of the things that Brent touched upon, which is what is money? And he's right. Money is not wealth. If you burned up all the currency today in the world, the wealth would still be there. I like to say there are three things. There's wealth, which is your time and your health, and that's it. There's nothing else that defines your wealth. Then there are things of value that don't lose their value. For example, gold is always valuable. Gold's good for, gold is obviously, it was used for jewelry for a long time as a malleable metal, but there is no cell phone industry without gold. You get the same amount of gold out of 40 cell phones as you get out of 40,000 tons of clay. So the reason why we invented currency, though, is that not everybody's labor is equally valuable. I am a software engineer. If you wanted to hire me to write software, I charged a ridiculous amount of money. I also am an amateur gardener. And if you want to hire me as a gardener, you would be a fool to pay the rates that I charge as a software engineer. The value of my labor is different based on what you want to do. Medicine is like that too, even though it's something that, I think most of the progressive socialist or communist system would say that we ought to have a quality of care. The fact of the matter is that your health care is greatly determined by the quality of your healthcare provider. I'm a person who, so I vape, I vote, but I have a smoking-related illness from having smoked a pack of cigarettes a day for 13 years. And I was in a spiral. I developed a smoking-related illness 3 years after I quit. It just so happens that I was working at Mass General, and I got to see an amazing doctor after having seen 4 other doctors who had done nothing for me. Is that equitable? The fact that I happened to be in the right place at the right time to see one of the few doctors on the planet? I don't know if it's equitable, but what happened is because of the fact that I am willing to, and I have the means to pay somebody to provide me with that high level quality of service, means that somebody else is going to say, hey, there's money over there. I can provide a service that is valuable. Because fundamentally, when you get paid in a currency, you're getting paid because you are serving humanity. Your service is worthwhile. Now, I agree with you. I agree with you guys fundamentally. Wealthy people should not be able to rewrite the rules. 100% I agree with that. The problem is the rules, not the wealth. Wealth shouldn't allow you to have that system. It is the creation of an authoritarian system that can be manipulated by money that is the problem, not money itself. Because money, fundamentally, it's just currency. It is a way for us to reasonably exchange different things. Like if you want to go to a concert and there aren't enough tickets, right? But if you're willing to pay for something, you're able to get in there. But there's no equitable way to distribute that, right? Not everybody gets to go see. If I name a musician here, I'm going to seem really old. But let's take a classic example, right? If you want to go see Frank Sinatra, his last show, right? That ticket was worth whatever it was worth to you personally. You get to trade as much of your labor as you want to go see that show. And I don't mean to monopolize here. So since it's supposed to be the time going back and forth. So maybe we can talk about that idea, about the idea of currency being the only way that we can exchange. And it is, you're right, it's an illusion. Currency is an illusion. It is this idea that we've come up with, but it's a way that allows us to trade disparate values and different sets of labor for whatever is valuable to us. So maybe we talk about that a little bit.
Can I get in there real quick? Okay, great. So again, I think that the point here, it's not that what you're saying is completely incorrect. It is true in a sense. But what the issue here is it's a very simplistic way of looking at it. For instance, the value of labor being tied to the skill, that's just not the case. The value, what you get paid for your labor is based upon one thing and one thing only: supply and demand. That's it. Nothing else. And this is a problem with our monetary system.
There are tons of software engineers out there who write a lot less good code than me.
Yeah, but that's fine. But again, and I'm sure you write great code, and if you can convince someone of that you can do it. But again, that would be the supply of engineers who can write good code and the demand. So, for instance, the Democrats are always screwing around with this. Like they'll say stuff like when they were ripping off Papa John's, they'll say better skills, better wages. That's literally not economically possible. Because what happens is take, for instance, everyone at McDonald's. We run a program that trains everyone who works at McDonald's to code to the standard that you're able to code at. Well, guess what? You and everyone that works at McDonald's then will make McDonald's wages. This is not a system where our contributions to society. No, it wouldn't, because it's not, because that's not the contribution to society. That's not what you are actually generating for the people that you work with. So what's happening here is what's going on here is this is essentially a bug in our monetary system. The other thing that I'm going to say is, take for instance, I hear this a lot. Let's make everybody like equally wealthy or something like that. I hear that a lot, where libertarians will say that the way to freedom is to make everybody rich through capitalism. The problem is that rich and poor are mutually dependent states. There is poverty as in dearth of stuff, and there is wealth as in having a lot of stuff. But being somebody who is poor or rich is specifically related to being near somebody else who is either poor or rich. How much would you have to pay Michael Bloomberg to come over and debug your computer? How much are you going to have to pay, or be a waiter at your next high society function? If everyone's a billionaire, being a billionaire means absolutely nothing. So again, labor is tied to things that it shouldn't necessarily be tied to, wages are tied to things that they shouldn't be tied to necessarily. So overall, what I'm going to say is I'm just going to quibble with the theory that you're giving me there. I think in a certain sense, it is correct, but it's just way too simplistic for the economy that we actually have, that we live in and work in today.
I just want to jump in and say that I feel like I'm not even really comfortable having this argument, because I'm not opposed to the existence of money, right? Money existed in the Soviet Union. Money exists in vast amounts today in China. It exists in Cuba. It exists in every socialist society that exists. And as long as there is scarcity of material goods, there will be a need for some form of currency. I'm not opposed to having currency exist as a means of exchanging that. I will say, however, that currency does not create wealth. Only human labor creates wealth, and it's not only Marx who said that with the labor theory of value. Before him, Adam Smith, the main theorist of capitalism, he also said it, and before him, the Roman Catholic Church said it. Right, that money only produces wealth when it is combined with human labor, and we live in a system, however, where people are becoming wealthy not by creating things, but by tearing things down. The opioid manufacturers got rich because a lot of people got addicted, and they worked very, very hard to get people addicted, right? We have a prison system that doesn't get rich from stopping crime, right? We have prisons for profit that gets rich from more people going to jail and being locked up. We have a situation where corporations get rich by making other people poor. And fundamental tasks that need to get done for a society to function, like having water that is properly purified and doesn't have lead in it, like having roads that aren't falling apart, like having a functioning public transportation system. These things aren't getting done because there's no profit for a capitalist in it, right? There are millions of young people out there today who have so much to contribute. The millennial generation is more skilled than any other generation in the past, but so many of them are stuck in low-wage, short-term service sector jobs because no capitalist can make a profit from hiring them. That's the problem, is the market incentivizes profits for shareholders. It doesn't necessarily incentivize what is good for all of society.
I do think that there's probably a point on which we can all agree, which is that corporation, such as it is a structure, that's a bad idea. Okay, a corporation is government extending its sovereign immunity to a group of people, which means that they can't be sued when they do something terrible, which means that they have immunity for their actions. That's actually wrong, right? The difference between a corporation and a private partnership is that in a partnership, everybody can be sued, okay, for the stuff that they've done wrong. In a corporation, you are protected through the power of the government. As a libertarian, I oppose that because I oppose government power fundamentally. And when we talk about the other things that corporations do, we talk about, there's a tendency towards monopoly. There has never been a monopoly in the history of the earth that didn't happen without collusion by the government. It is government that creates the power. We talk about the fact.
Well, hang on.
Why wouldn't the government do that?
Why does government do it? Because they're paid off.
Yeah. So why, if you had a monopoly, if you had a huge amount of money, why wouldn't you pay the government to give you a monopoly?
I might. The problem is government shouldn't have that power. And whenever
if you're the rich person who's setting the rules, why would you write the rules to not give yourself that power?
Of course you would. That's why you shouldn't allow a system of government that is so authoritarian that it can set rules for other people. Fundamentally, you guys say, I'm worried about all the stuff that corporations are going to do, but I trust government. You can't trust government. Government is what corporation is using. Government is what other people will use as well. When you endow people with that much power, it gets abused. All power resonates from the people. Power to the people. That's what we're talking about. The people are the ones who are supposed to be in control of their own lives and destiny, not corporations and not governments.
Well, hang on. I have to quibble just a little bit with the idea that monopolies don't happen without government. Monopolies absolutely happen without government. It's what's called in economics a natural monopoly. A good example would be railroad tracks.
No, but railroads, the government was hand in fist with the railroad companies.
Indeed, it did. But again, that's not the point here. The point is, you don't want whether the government worked with them or not. You don't want a bunch of competing railroad tracks all over the place. And the same thing, you don't because for the same reason you don't want competing water pipelines running to every house. So every house has 12 water pipelines. It's just a waste. It makes sense for certain services.
It would be a waste, but it would be good for the consumer.
No, it'd be bad for the consumer because how the hell what are you going to do with 12 water lines?
I mean, you have the option. I mean, if somebody else wants to do it, right? If somebody wants to make the expense to do it, why would we stop them? Look at the electricity.
Because they're going to be ripping up the ground and wasting resources in a planet with limited space.
You probably live in a place where you can buy your electricity from different providers.
Yeah, but that's only because the government forces that.
Well, the fact of the matter is, though, that there's competition that didn't used to do that. There used to be just one monopoly for power.
Well, yeah, because the company laid the power lines.
There used to be one monopoly for water, but now when people start to have other alternatives for water, that's actually beneficial because
but they only have other alternatives because of the state. The state forces that. The water still goes through the same pipe. There's not like Exxon's water pipe and some German water company's water pipe. It's one water pipe.
Most of the infrastructure, admittedly, is created by the state way back when. But if you look at what's happening now, the new stuff that's coming in, for example, do you feel like you're hurt because of the fact that you could either get Fios or Comcast, that different companies have run an electric cable, cable to your house? The fact of the matter is that Comcast is a monopoly. Granted, it's monopoly by the government, by the local government, where it usually sells it. In places where there is more than one cable provider, your cable prices don't go up that much. Your internet prices don't go up that much. But a place where there is only one cable provider, of course, corporations will do what they can to maximize their profit through the power of government. Cables are granted a monopoly by the municipal government.
Yeah, but to go back to what Caleb was saying, you're a rich man.
Yes.
Why would you not build a government to then set rules to make you richer?
Yeah, no, I agree 100%. We shouldn't have a government that can do that.
Okay, then we shouldn't have rich people that can build a government that can do that.
No, that's like saying you shouldn't have freedom.
I mean,
and I disagree with that. You should have freedom. And if you want to use your freedom to become a rich person, that's okay. If you want to use your freedom to help the poor, that's okay. I don't get to.
Well, hang on. Where does freedom end?
This is where libertarians always strike me as far, far more idealistic than Marxists and communists. I can point to socialist societies and criticize their flaws and failures, but libertarians constantly talk about this ideal world where people will have, huge amounts of wealth and other people will be starving, but there won't be mobs out on the street and there won't be rich, people bribing the government to get an other end. Where has real capitalism ever existed? I mean, what society can you point to as an example of real capitalism?
The best example I would say is the American West after the Civil War, before come in. I mean, at that point in time,
when we murdered all the Native Americans.
Society based on theft.
most law enforcement then is handled by volunteers. There might be a sheriff, but usually people take care of things themselves. Are the people of that day racist? Yeah, they were products of their time, no question about it, and that's not defensible. They had moved on from slavery, but what happened to the Indians is absolutely a crime, no question about it. But in the society that they lived in, if you were to go into a Western town, you would find it to be pretty capitalistic. People paid for what they wanted.
No doubt. I mean, it certainly was. I don't see that as an ideal. Let me add, though, about the point about the corporation. I don't find anything particularly wrong with the concept, right? A corporation is basically the government and the private sector kind of working together. But I've often articulated to people that the difference between capitalism and socialism is that in capitalism, the corporations control the government. But in socialism, the government controls the corporations. And that's the difference, right? In China, they've got a huge state-controlled telecommunications corporation called Huawei. It makes the best phones in the world. But if you look at it, sure, it's technically private. It's called a cooperative under Chinese law. But if you look at it, its main, business partner is the Chinese military. People on the boards are in the Chinese military, right? It does business in coordination with the, 5-year economic plan set by the Chinese Communist Party. It's basically a state-controlled industry, but it brings in foreign investors. It allows a lot of private companies to do business with them and be contracted by them, right? But Huawei is completely different than Apple in the way that it functions, because Huawei does what the Chinese government says, whereas Donald Trump does what Apple says, right? If you look at it, Donald Trump has declared war on Huawei at this point, just basically because they make better phones, because Apple doesn't want to compete with them. And so Donald Trump is starting a trade war and trying to convince us all, oh my God, Huawei, and going all over the world to stop them in 5G, doing a favor to Apple because it's and what our private companies can do in the West.
Yeah. If I can, I spent some time going after Dan. So Caleb, I'm going to challenge you a little bit on this. Sure. I really see what you're saying here. And I do think that there is a lot of potential in coordinating an economy from the top for if it's actually done for the people and it's actually done democratically. But I have two issues with this. The first one that I'd like to challenge you with is the idea that we can even necessarily do that. Because, again, these states are controlled by small groups of people at the top. And yes, there's a bureaucracy and there's certain ways that people move up, and not, Trump is not the only person in control, even though he likes to pretend like he is. There are people behind him, and there's a huge network holding that up. But the thing is that the higher you climb in that network, the less connected to the actual people you are, because you have different priorities, you have a different world going on, and that can lead to either malice or a lot of problems via stupidity. I mean, one of the big issues with a lot of countries like Venezuela, for instance, and people blame it on socialism. But the issue is not so much socialism as the paradox of plenty. There's the same problems are going on in places like Saudi Arabia and Russia, which is, sadly no longer communist. What you've got is you have these countries that have a great deal of wealth, be it in oil or gold or whatever, diamond mines, but that wealth is concentrated in one or two industries, which then pushes one or two families, small groups of people, up to the heights of power, and they essentially fleece the country and run things the way they want to. And then eventually, as in the case of Venezuela, when the global price of oil drops, bam, the whole economy goes out because everything is dependent on one industry. The one good thing that I think capitalism really has going for it is there is a diversity of industries where power is kind of distributed economically between, not in great ways, but I think you and I talked about it, where certain political factions are like big oil deciding to fight Silicon Valley. I don't like big oil and I don't like Silicon Valley, but I do like it when they're at each other's throats.
Well, look at Uber challenging the taxi industry, right? I mean, that's an industry that, it's the definition of a state-sponsored industry, right? The state give a specific license so that there will only be one taxi company. Yeah. Just like we're only going to have one water system and we're only going to have one system of pipes running into your house. There's only one taxi company until Uber finds a way around it. Okay. I think
We can talk about
Uber has made it better. Now, the company itself, well, that's a different issue. But the idea of ride sharing, of competition in the ride service industry, that's a huge benefit. That happened because of capitalism. Somebody found a way to be paid for the service that they wanted to provide. They wanted to provide a service to society. There's nothing wrong with wanting to serve society. We shouldn't be embarrassed by that. And there's nothing wrong with wanting to be compensated for serving society.
Well, I want to speak to what Brent talked about first, and then I want to speak to the Uber thing, because I actually have an interesting point to make on both of those. So as far as Brent and the oil stuff, it's interesting because Russia's economic model at this point, Russia, the fall of the Soviet Union, they privatized all kinds of things, right? And it was a libertarian social experiment. Jeffrey Sachs of Columbia University went in there, sold the country off under Yeltsin, Bill Clinton's best bud, who we meddled in their elections and helped Yeltsin get reelected. Everyone knows that. They sold it off, right? And there were times where in the 90s, the Russian government didn't even have the ability to collect taxes. They would try to tax corporations, and they just say, yeah, we have a bigger army than you, so they didn't even care. You should watch some of these documentaries, right? Russia in the 1990s, that is libertarianism in practice. But Putin fixed it by nationalizing oil and gas. He created two state-controlled mega oil energy companies, Rosneft and Gazprom. And now Russia sells oil and gas on the international markets. The revenue goes into the state, and the state then subsidizes other industries like steel manufacturing, like titanium, like all kinds of things. Like they're having at this point a farming boom again, and they're using state-controlled sale of energy. And Venezuela is very similar, right? Venezuela, the government calls itself a socialist government, but if you look at it, their rate of state ownership is much lower than the rate in China, right? I mean, it's really only oil that's controlled by the government, oil and banking. But every private company basically depends on a subsidy from the oil sector to function. So it's not functioning according to the irrational chaos of the market, right? And because of that, they were able to wipe out illiteracy in Venezuela. They were able to have some big achievements. But then
their La Sistema music program was incredible.
Yeah, they did some on that sector. And Gaddafi's Libya is very similar kind of economic model. You can call it Petro Socialism, where the government controls a specific resource, sells it on the international markets, and then controls the economy by handing out the revenue from it, right? And that's a model, but it's particularly weak when oil prices drop so dramatically as they did under Barack Obama, when the Saudis were flooding the market with oil and bankrupting themselves. It can cause big problems, as we saw in Venezuela, and other countries had big problems. Iran had big problems. It's an oil-based country, but it's a particularly interesting model, and I guess I just wanted to speak to that. But it is a case where, if you look at, what made like Nigeria, which was an oil-rich country, it's very poor, different than Venezuela, is when the oil was booming. In Venezuela, they were using it to stimulate all of society, whereas in Nigeria, a group of, a handful of people that were in bed with ExxonMobil and Chevron and BP were getting wealthier, and Nigeria's conditions didn't really change. You still have mass illiteracy there. You still have mass homelessness. And I think that when the government controls those resources and is using them to organize the economy, that's different than when you just have, big corporations, buying up a country's natural resources. Now, as far as the thing with Uber, I've done stories. There was a cab driver here in New York City who killed himself because he had spent so many years trying to get a medallion, trying to get that license so he could make that money. Uber comes along, and all of a sudden, cab drivers are making nothing compared to what they used to make. And why? Uber is better than what existed before. It's a technological advance to be able to call them on your phone. It's better. And in a rational socialist society, that would be a good thing. But only under capitalism does technological advance lead to greater poverty, right? That's the reality. Under capitalism, people get poorer as technology advances. This is not rational. People shouldn't become more poor because our economy is becoming more efficient. That's the inherent problem of capitalism.
If you sell something, you shouldn't get paid for it.
I'm sorry, Dan, hang on one second. I know you guys are ready to go. I just want to say thanks, everybody, for being here. Everybody, looks like we got a pretty good crowd. Make sure and tag me with your questions. Tag @ConverseContender. I'm gonna put like some waving hands in the chat right now in case you're unfamiliar, and just go ahead and tag me with all your questions. We are going to get the questions in about 10 minutes. Okay, so we're gonna wrap this up for about 10 minutes. We got about 49 likes. If we can get 15 more likes, then we'll go for another 15 minutes instead of 10. How about that? So definitely smash the like button, and we'll go for another 10 or 15 minutes, and then we'll go into question and answer. So go ahead, Dan.
So real quick, though, Dan, before you say anything here, I just wanted to point. I get what you're saying there, Caleb, and I especially agree at the end what we were talking about with regard to the poor gentleman who killed himself over the cab medallion. But what I was talking about primarily with the issue of the paradox of plenty is what's worrying me about the idea of putting that much power into the hands of the government is essentially you're putting too many eggs in one basket. And when something fails in that instance, you get the wrong person into power, you get the wrong industry subsidizing everything. It can be absolutely disastrous. I think we really need a more diverse economy and a more diverse distribution of power in order specifically to guard against that. When everyone is powerful as opposed to just a few people, it's harder to get things done, but also one or two bad people with bad ideas can't screw it up so badly.
Right. The thing about it, you said Putin fixed what was broken in communism by essentially stopping people from being independent. You definitely said Putin fixed it.
Putin fixed communism.
Communism was gone by the time.
Communism was gone throughout the Yeltsin years. Yeah.
Right. So you talked about the fact that he brought it back, so now the state is subsidizing industries. That's cronyism. That's exactly what you were arguing against beforehand. Cronyism is always bad. Okay? When the state is sponsoring the industry, when the state is benefiting things, that's cronyism. That is crony capitalism. The people who have the benevolence from the state, they're the ones who prosper. That is not capitalism. That is cronyism. The two things are different. In capitalism, there is never anybody with power giving any advantage to another, to an organization. Everybody has to compete on merit. Now, a lot of times, there are some things that we can't control. I'm going to buy this thing from my brother rather than, the most competitive art that's out there, or whatever reasons, we might have a cultural thing where I'm only going to buy from my community instead of buying outside of it. But those are voluntary. There's nothing we should do. We shouldn't stop people from supporting people in their community. The state shouldn't get to say, you know what? You have to buy from everybody equitably. You can't just support the people that you like with your business. You get to choose how you allocate your business, who you're going to buy things from. And that's never going to be allowed under communism.
Let me reiterate the point I was making, because I feel like there's kind of a lack of communication. After the fall of the Soviet Union, right, you had, Gorbachev, the Communist Party's forced out. Yeltsin came into office, and he began implementing free market policies, right, where he was privatizing things. George Soros and Jeffrey Sachs were there implementing libertarian Chicago School Milton Friedman economics, right? And
the country, most Russian forms have ever been, by the way.
And it was a disaster. Right. I mean, mass unemployment, mass drug addiction, mass suicides. I mean, it was, people were starving on the streets. I mean, it was when an economy is just destroyed like that, you have the rise of an underground economy. It was very similar to what happened in Pinochet's Chile, very similar to what happened all across South America when they were implementing these policies in Latin America in the 80s and 90s. Putin was able to restore Russia's GDP and industrial output, was able to stabilize the economy by reasserting a level of state control. Right?
Why was there an underground economy, the underground economy that you were talking about that developed? Why did that develop?
The overall economy was demolished. American companies would buy steel plants and just close them down. It was the country.
That would be underground. That would just be
basically. What?
That wouldn't be underground. That would just be the economy.
Well, the underground economy was people were starving, and so they were finding ways to get by, like sell heroin or be involved in crime and And that was what was happening, and that's what happened in Pinochet's Chile as well. Pinochet, ended the food subsidies. He privatized all kinds of things. People were starving. People were desperate. And so, yes, child prostitution went through the roof, and drug people do other things. Above ground economy is destroyed. The underground economy flourishes. That's a reality. People have to survive. You're talking about factories were closed down in our urban areas. You saw a rise in the drug trade in urban centers, right? Because people, when they don't have above ground ways to survive, they tend to do underground ways.
Yeah, I have a quick question for Dan. I got a question for you, Dan. If I could break in on this here, I'm not asking this rhetorically. I genuinely want to know your answer here. So here's the thing: what Caleb's talking about, or the case with the cab driver, and the people that essentially get left behind, the folks who could not afford to get the medical care they needed, and so they died. Right. What is the sense in tying someone's access to the things that they need to live a reasonably comfortable and happy life, where they can go out and grab whatever piece of happiness they can find in this incredibly short time we have on Earth? What is the sense in tying that to their ability to get paid on the market? Why do we have to withhold necessary food, housing, shelter from people who may just not be good at business for whatever reason? Especially, like, even in a perfect system, let's say everyone that works hard gets what they want, and everyone that is lazy or stupid doesn't. Do we really want to let all the lazy and the stupid people die? Do we want to let them live in misery? Or do we want to actually build a society that works for everyone, not just the elite?
We can do that without coercion. Okay? I mean, like, what kept you safe on the Appalachian Trail?
What kept me safe?
It was the community.
Yeah.
It was the people who were there. People shared stuff with you voluntarily, all these amazing things that happened, and yet you're not willing to extend the benefit of that to society as a large.
I'm willing to extend the benefit of that to society as a large. What I'm not willing to do is I'm not willing to extend the benefit of that to Donald Trump, Mike Bloomberg, and Jeff Bezos. If those three found me on the trail with a broken leg, they'd either leave me or try to turn it to their advantage. Now, any other thru hiker in the community, any of the people in the trail towns, they found me, they'd immediately take me to the hospital. And then I'd be settled with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt that I couldn't pay.
There are always going to be bad actors in every society. And, whether it's communism, socialism, capitalism, whatever, there are always going to be bad actors. The question is...
so why do we build this? I'm sorry, I didn't mean to finish what you were saying. I didn't want to interrupt you.
What level of authority are you willing to endow somebody with to take away another person's liberty because of that threat? Because really, the worst thing you can do to somebody is to take away their liberty. Fundamentally, when you take away liberty, you are approaching slavery. We agreed that slavery is a bad thing, okay? The less liberty I have, the closer I am to slavery. Would we agree on that?
Well, I would say no one in any part of the world was talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness until the 1700s in Europe. And there was a reason for that. It wasn't that people were evil until then and they just suddenly became good in 1776 or whenever John Locke started writing. It was that we had not yet reached an economic stage that made that possible. The hunter-gatherer civilization was very authoritarian. Those tribes, people didn't even have a sense of individuality, right? You had slavery after that. Feudalism introduced a new level of freedom where people had their little tract of land and paid their land. And it wasn't
talking about what about
economy with that level of freedom? Economic advancement and prosperity leads to a higher level of freedom. That is a reality. And as societies become more prosperous, the level of freedom increases. For example, in the United States, the level of freedom of speech and freedom of assembly that we have now, we didn't really have it up until like 1969, 68, the Warren Court rulings. I could be put in jail for saying the kind of things I was saying throughout most of the 50s, 30s, 20s. But as the USA became more prosperous and more stable, it became safer to allow dissidents like me to say what we say, right? That freedom and liberty is rooted in economic advancement and that there is a material basis for it. And that is absent, right? That is a fundamental reality that is missing from all of this. I don't think that all of human history was capable of achieving socialism. Socialism was only possible after capitalism had been achieved, and capitalism
capitalism.
We're talking about slavery and capital. You get what I'm saying.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Well, hang on. There's just one thing I want to say. I don't think it's actually correct that hunter-gatherer societies were authoritarian. There may have been some, but I believe the anthropological consensus on this is that those were the freest societies in the world. And even if you look at today's hunter-gatherer societies, for the most part, they are not heavily authoritarian.
I'm going to give you an example. You say nobody's talking about freedom, right? What about Ishmael, right? He goes off and he says, you know what? Fuck these rules. I'm leaving. Can I swear on your show, Converse?
I'll allow it. I'll allow it. Hey, but how about
I just came
how
out.
about this,
He's
Dan?
living. You guys know the frontier thesis, right? The reason why America is different from any other country is because when you didn't like what was going on, you moved 20 miles to the west and you were on the frontier again. You could do whatever you wanted. That's freedom. And so that idea that you can always go, there was always freedom in old societies because if you didn't like what it was, you could go somewhere else. Now, there's not really a lot of other place to go, so we have to find a way to live with each other. But freedom is a much older idea.
But we could only go somewhere else because we murdered the Native Americans.
The Old Testament laws, there wasn't very much freedom back then. I mean, I would look at some of the Old Testament laws that existed. It was quite an authoritarian society. One could be killed for saying Jehovah, I believe.
In some places, yes, people chose to live with it. But I'm talking about Ishtar, right?
Okay.
Right?
So,
Ishmael leaves. Where does he go? There's no authority there. Sorry,
Dan. Let's do this. Let's take 1 to 2 minutes each person and wrap up your. Let's draw together some of the threads of this conversation. Kind of, give your closing remarks about what should people take away from your point of view, and you want to maybe start with Dan.
Sure. All right, I'm going to go 2 minutes. My name is Dan Fishman. I am the executive director of the Libertarian Party. You can find out more about us at lp.org. And if you want to sign up and become a member, lp.org/join. We stand for the idea that you belong to you. We have 2 principles only. Number 1, you own yourself. Number 2, it's not okay to use force against another person for economic or political gain. People famously know that libertarians are in favor of legalizing cannabis. We're not in favor of legalizing cannabis because we want you to get high. I mean, if you want to get high, that's okay. But fundamentally, we're in favor of legalizing cannabis because you own your body. We're not going to tell you what you can and cannot put into it, and we're not going to use force against you to stop you from doing it. And that's what government is. Government is force telling you how to live your life. You are the best arbiter of what should happen to your body, what should happen to yourself. Do you know the libertarians famously were the people who first supported marriage equality in the country? The reason why? Why would we possibly think that government should be involved in marriage, right? Government doesn't get to decide what a family looks like. You look at the famous Russian society, they have this award, the Matsgeroen. The Matsgeroen was an award given out if you had 10 children because the Russians were concerned about the ethnic breakup of their state. Is that what the state's supposed to do? It's supposed to encourage population growth? No. Is it supposed to define a family? No. Libertarians believe you get to define what works for you. And like I said before, libertarians believe communists can be as communist as they want. Socialists can be as socialist as they want. Just don't force anybody else to live by your rules. We had a conversation a little earlier talking about religion. America has pretty good religious tolerance. Okay, Catholics don't think that just because they might win an election, all the Protestants now have to live under their rules. Jews don't think that if they win an election, all the Muslims have to live under their rules. But for some reason, all the other political parties think that if they win an election, they get to make the laws and you have to live under their rules. So instead, what we think, let's change it so that we have a society where there's only 2 rules. Number 1, you own yourself. Number 2, it's not okay to use force. It is not okay to use coercion to get other people to do what you want to do. Persuade people all you want. I encourage you to be a persuasive motherfucker.
All right.
Find a way to get your point across. And that's the best way to win an argument.
All right, Dan.
Dan, Director, lp.org.
Dan, thanks so much for that those closing remarks. Now we'll go to Brenton. You want to kind of close up and give your closing?
Sure. So my name, again, is Brenton Lengel. I'm a poet, playwright, activist, and journalist. You can look me up at my website, brentonlengel.com. I'm most famous for North to Maine, the first play ever about the Appalachian Trail, and my comic, Snow White Zombie Apocalypse, which was just published by Scout Comics. Got a great response, sold out, and we are currently running a Kickstarter to finance the second one. I hate money because I should be making the comic, but I'm running a Kickstarter. But it's doing really well, and if you guys want to check it out, there's a bunch of great rewards. So just Google Snow White Zombie Apocalypse Kickstarter, or I believe the link is in the description. To kind of close out my points here, and I don't want to rebut too many things, but the thing is that I hear this line of argumentation a lot from libertarians, that and what you need to remember is that the libertarians there were plenty of libertarians that were against marriage equality. Sometimes they'd say free people don't ask for permission, in a way of saying like, hey, gay people don't actually get marriage equality. Also, libertarians famously opposed the Bill of Rights, or I'm sorry, not the Bill of Rights, the Ron Paul hates it. The civil rights legislation. They supported segregated swimming pools. I don't think Dan does that.
That's not true.
Yeah,
that's just not true, because segregated swimming pools are created by laws and government.
Yeah, and also private citizens saying I'm allowed to keep people away from my lunch counter.
Exactly.
The thing is I think what we need to do is we need to look beyond a couple simple rules to try and live by, and instead do our best to live life in a compassionate way where we enhance the lives of those around us and in turn help them bring out their potential. I really think that the best way to do that is to free people, but you can't free people by taking too much for yourself. An injury to one is an injury to all, and there can only be freedom when we stop injuring each other.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Brenton. And we'll move to Caleb for the final response, and then we'll move into Q&A. So tag me at Converse Contender if you have any final questions.
Well, if you want to check me out, I'm on YouTube. I do YouTube Lives almost every weekend. I'm posting videos all the time. My name is Caleb Maupin, CalebMaupin. I'm at calebmaupin.com. You can check me out. I've written a book on socialism called City Builders and Vandals in Our Age. It's gotten a lot of good reviews. Let me put it this way. There is a popular advocate of capitalism on the internet named Ben Shapiro. And one of Ben Shapiro, he said the strongest argument against socialism is this: socialism is dumb because it says, quote, I owe you shit because you're breathing. Well, if you think about that quote, right? If a baby is born and its parents do not feed it, we put those parents in jail for criminal neglect because those parents owe that baby food because it's breathing, right? They have an obligation to it, right? And that the way society generally functions, we do as a society believe that we owe people a certain amount of stuff for existing. That's the reality. And that the thing is, human beings are collective creatures. Every beautiful thing that's been done in human history, every beautiful work of art, every beautiful facility, everything is the result of collective human labor. There is barely anything, maybe there's some wood carver out there, but there's barely anything that anyone can point to and say, I made this all by myself. And in fact, that wood carver is probably using a knife. That knife involved 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 different people in the manufacturing process. Everything beautiful about human civilization is the product of collective efforts by human beings. We are collective creatures in our essence. And since the rise of capitalism, we have been gripped by the ideology of liberalism. And economic liberalism is free market capitalism. Social liberalism is individual liberty. But it's this idea that the individual it takes precedence above all else, that the individual comes first, society comes last. But throughout all of human existence, if you look at our history, we have been collective creatures and we have achieved things collectively. And not only do I believe that society has an obligation to people, that people are owed health care, people are owed a decent job and a decent life, but I believe people have an obligation to society. We need to bring back the idea that people, yes, should be obligated to work to build a better world. People should be obligated to go out and help their neighbors. Yes, that we need to think in collective terms. The United States is crumbling right now. I don't even know what does it mean to be an American at this point? What does it even mean at this point? Right? The country is moving in about 500 different directions: greed, selfishness, demoralization, depression. We are in a mess of individualism gone mad. We need collective vision, and we need a government of action that will fight for working families.
All right, Caleb, thanks so much for those closing remarks. So now we'll move into the Q&A while I'm pulling up the questions that I have from the chat.
Yeah. While you're doing that, I really want to apologize to Dan really quick, because I think it was wrong of me to take a direct shot at you in my 2 minutes. So I apologize for that.
No worries.
Yeah,
it just boiled. It burrowed into my head, and I had to say something.
Yeah, I understand it's hard to summarize and not respond to some of the things that you're disagreeing with throughout. So yeah, it's not a problem at all. Also, while I'm pulling these up, I'm gonna exercise moderator privilege and ask a question myself. So for everybody, I think I know Dan's. I think I know what Dan's response may be, but for everybody, would you rather the rich come down and the poor stay the same, or would you rather the rich go up and the poor go up? So maybe if you guys want to try and just give your best response, and we'll this will just be like a quick response, and then we'll move on to the question.
Well, I guess I'll begin by saying I want everyone to move up, and the ultimate goal of a world without any coercion, in which the state fades away and people can just do what they need, from each according to his own ability, to each according to their needs. That's only possible with vast material abundance. When Bernie Sanders, I like Bernie Sanders in many ways, but when he says abolish billionaires, I don't agree with him. I want everyone to live far better than billionaires live today. That's the only way we can get away from the need for class society, the need for a state and coercion, is with vast abundance where people can live freely in a world of economic prosperity. That is the ultimate vision of a classless, stateless world of communism, is vast abundance. So I want to raise everyone to far higher levels than they're at now.
Awesome. Thank you. Brenton?
Yeah, so your question was, would I rather the rich come down and the poor go up, or both the rich and the poor go up?
Yeah. No. Would you rather the rich come down and the poor stay the same, or they both move up?
It's not possible. The rich and poor are, like, I understand what you're saying there, but what you're forgetting is that these states are directly related to each other. So that what you have described physically cannot happen. A great example, actually, is if you look at the fact that the United States currently has enough empty homes for every homeless person to have 7 to themselves. We throw away and let rot 50% of the food that we produce. And this is, again, because we have this situation where wealth and abundance is not, it's not a fixed pie, but it constantly expands. And it's not about how much someone has, it is about the proportion. What we need is equality, and what we need to do there. So I'm actually with Bernie Sanders on that. Eliminate billionaires, because if you eliminate billionaires, you will lift so many people out of poverty. And the closer we get, I don't think we'll ever have a society that's 100% equal. And in fact, it may be a good idea to have a little bit of inequality, because some people are smarter, some people are able and better leaders and are able to do things. But not even Jesus deserves to be a billionaire. There is no possible contribution to society, no amount of intelligence that any human being could possibly have that would ever justify that level of power. And the more we allow that to happen, the more we allow a foolish, unworthy person to get into that position. And when they get into that position, they hurt people.
All right.
So, yeah.
Thanks. Go ahead.
You destroy the rich so you can destroy the poor.
Thanks so much,
or
Brenton.
not destroy, but you know what I mean.
Yeah. All right, Dan. We'll take your point of view now.
Jesus could have been a billionaire. He chose not to be. He chose to live with the poor. And even though they could have implemented things, it was important that people have free will. That was the critical element of that. Your free will is what defines you. And when people take that away from you, they're taking away the greatest gift of your birthright, the greatest gift of your humanity, which is the ability to choose for yourself. the ability to choose to make stupid decisions. If I were to list all the stupid decisions I made in my life, I would go over my time. So let's just say that there's a lot of them, but that's what made me who I am. I've quoted a lot of esoteric people. I'm going to quote the butthole surfers right now. It's better to regret something you have done than to regret something you haven't. And
I like how you're the most foul-mouthed of the three of us.
I am. I can't help it. That's the nature of what I do. But it's a critical element. It's better to have the freedom to make mistakes than to live in a controlled life where your mom tells you all the time, or the nanny state, don't do this, you're going to burn your hand.
Cool. Thanks for that, Dan. Yes, cool reference as well. I grew up punk rock, so I definitely appreciate the reference. So we'll move on to our first question from the chat. Actually, first we have a super chat from Steven Steen, $2 super chat. Hey, Comrade Converse. I think that was a reference to the communism, and I'm surprised they still let that guy in here. All right, let's move on. Steven Steen again. Thank you for your question. Question for Brenton. How does a society operate without money? Are you proposing a bartering system?
No, I'm not proposing a bartering system. In fact, barter was never, ever actually a system. That's just something Adam Smith made up because he was a town and city dweller in the 1700s, and he looked out his window and said to himself, I wonder how people functioned without money. No, you know what? Honestly, there's a lot of ways you could make it work without money. I think what's really interesting in the technological age is what's called swarm intelligence. And I would highly recommend you look this up because essentially they used these computer models to aggregate all of a huge number data from a huge number of people, and what it wound up doing was outperforming both the Vegas odds and also expert predictions, and correctly got the winner of the Kentucky Derby. This technology functions better than markets, and it functions better than expertise. You could say that Caleb's position is expertise, that you put the smart people in charge of various industries, and we plan it with a few individual exceptional human minds. Dan's is the markets. Well, the problem with the experts is oftentimes they're not as great experts as they seem to think they are. And the problem with markets is that markets are biased towards the previous actor within the market. Monkey see, monkey do. Swarm technology eliminates that bias, and it can get us much closer to where humans essentially function like a swarm of bees, where the swarm itself is smarter than the sum of its parts. So I'd be interested to see something like that. I'm not a programmer, so I can't go into huge detail, but I'm really excited by that technology. But beyond that, I mean, honestly, if I just be a person, like if we stopped caring about counting all of these beans and making sure that everybody gets paid and everybody gets a certain amount of numbers to go up into their account, and just gave people and treated them as though I am my brother's keeper and they treated us that way in return, our society would be a paradise. We have the technology, we have the labor power, we have the resources. You know, the only thing that's holding us back from that golden age is fear. So, you know, what I say is just toss it aside, live without fear, and stop squirreling away, tokens to make sure that we don't starve. It's a savage system, and we need to move beyond it. And also, it's really annoying.
All right. All right. Thanks so much for that, Brent. So we'll move on to our next question, and I just want to let everybody know out there, if you haven't already liked or subscribed, please do so, because if you're unfamiliar, the way that we kind of judge the debates that we have is by popularity. So, like, if we get 200 likes on one video about religion, then we're going to want to, have more religious debates. But I'm actually really enjoying this debate because each of these guys are doing so well to representing their position in a coherent manner, but also it's not a dumpster fire. They're keeping it cordial. So if you like these type, if you enjoy this type of debate, go ahead and hit that like button. That way that we can, it'll let us know. And also, We're going to move on to our next question, but if we can try to pretend like this is like one of the political debates, and I like to develop my points in full, and I'm sure you guys do too. But if we could just try and maybe limit it to about a minute because we've already been going over an hour and a half. So, next question is Jesse Camping. Question for Caleb. Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah. Question for Caleb. He spoke of Russia. I was there. What year was he there, or can he comment on living conditions in rural Russia while they are becoming a technical elite?
Well, I've been over there quite a bit, and I encourage you to look into the economic history of what went on in the 1990s when capitalism was restored, and what went on in the 1930s when the 5-year plans led by the Soviet government were the marvel of the whole world at what they were achieving. They industrialized. They built some of the world's largest hydroelectric power plants. They built some of the biggest steel mills in the world. An entire country was lit up with electricity. Illiteracy was wiped out, all with a centrally planned economy. There's no reason, no one's here to say that Stalin did nothing wrong or defend human rights violations. But we can't ignore the reality that socialism turned Russia into a superpower. Socialism has turned China into a superpower, while capitalism is keeping countries all across the world, like Haiti, like Nigeria, poor. So the reality is that centrally planned economies can produce growth. And what you've been told your whole life, that socialism never achieved anything and failed everywhere, is a big, fat lie.
Let me follow up a couple things about that. First of all, Russia being lit up by electricity, you can find satellite photos of what the world looked like at night in 1970, and you'll find Russia to be pretty damn dark compared to the United States. Secondly, the idea, so I was in Russia in 1985, and since you've been there, you'll be familiar with this phrase, "U vas есть?" Do you have? Whenever you go to a Russian restaurant under communism, you didn't order from the menu. You said, "U vas есть?" Do you have? Because there were so many shortages that they didn't have anything that was on the menu. That was a constant thing. Long lines. You can see the visit of Boris Yeltsin when he came to the United States, and he couldn't believe, he was in Houston, and he went to a Kroger, and he couldn't believe how much food was in the supermarket. He actually thought it was fake. So they took him to another supermarket and said, "Oh, look, here it is." And he said, "How incredibly efficient, right? 40 different brands of bacon." Dude, bacon's awesome. We should always have 40 brands of bacon.
And then we all die of a heart attack.
No. That's actually food. That's a government telling you that bacon's actually not that bad for you. Haiti is not an example of capitalism. Jean-Jacques Duvalier is probably one of the worst dictators in the history of the planet. Papa Doc.
Thanks so much for that. Caleb, do you want a brief response?
Sure. The fact that the Soviet Union faced an economic blockade and had all kinds of problems, compared to when capitalism was implemented, polls overwhelmingly show Soviet nostalgia is still very high, because people say life was better than what happened when capitalism went in there. And Haiti is a great example of capitalism. In the 1990s, they signed on with NAFTA. They've got free trade. American agribusiness has put all their farmers out of business. People all over the world are fleeing libertarian countries. Guatemala, that's a libertarian country. They got free market, deregulation. They don't even have a government post office anymore. And people are trying to get out as fast as they can. People are trying to flee Honduras. We overthrew the socialist government. They've got a free market regime. People are trying to get out. When Libya was socialist under Gaddafi, people from all over the African continent were trying to get into Libya to get a share of that oil wealth. Now people are drowning in the Mediterranean trying to get out of Libya because Libya has joined the global free trade system, and international oil companies are ruining the place, and the place is in ruin, right? If you look at Eastern Europe, when capitalism was restored, it was an economic disaster. The socialist countries built themselves up from nothing. They built themselves up from nothing, and they've had really big achievements. The United States at this point, we have total free market, unregulated capitalism. This is the most libertarian country in the Western world. And if you compare our education, and the quality of our education to Europe, where it's much more state controlled, if you compare our life expectancy to countries where the government runs healthcare, we are in a mess of individualism here. All over the world, people are fleeing libertarian policies, and the United States at this point is crumbling because we have this belief. We believe greed is good. that profits lead to prosperity. We believe this, right? We believe this, right? You know, people aren't entitled to health care. Why should the government give people health care? You know, that's not my problem. That's the American way, and look how well it's working out for us. This country, with our gap between the rich and poor, I mean, this is capitalism. Capitalism is Honduras. Capitalism is Guatemala. Capitalism is Nigeria. The poorest countries of the world are capitalist. The poorest, you know, this is the reality.
All right,
so people are fleeing capitalist countries and voting with their feet. And where are they going?
Brief.
Well, that's not entirely fair.
All right, guys.
We've got all the resources.
Free market African countries are fleeing European countries that have bigger welfare states. People
are people going to China?
Hey, guys, I think our moderator wants to say something.
Highly developed United States, which even the USA has more market regulations than like Guatemala does. You know what I mean? Like, this is just
so that we can.
This is a distortion. This idea everyone's trying to get out of the socialist countries. This is just hype. I've heard this my whole life, and it's just malarkey, right? So, I mean, we've all in the United States, and that's the whole thing. If your ideology is the state ideology in the United States, in a government school, I heard the same stuff you've been preaching your whole life. Like, my teachers told me that communism never works, capitalism's the best thing. Our state apparatus is feeding us the love for the corporations that run the state, right?
All right,
I mean, you are preaching the state ideology of American imperialism.
All right, Caleb, thanks so much for that. Just so we're fair to the audience and getting all the questions in, because we got quite a bit of questions. If we could, we're gonna try and get through them a little quicker than you know. I know everybody's got what James calls a bullet in the chamber, like a round ready to go, right? But we want to just to be fair to everybody else, we want to try and get through as many as possible. So, and some of these will bring back up your point that you want to say now whenever a question's targeted towards you. So, Jefferson's Spatchcock says, question for Dan: are you as concerned about the I don't know what this term is.
Spell it.
Coercion. Oh, maybe it's
coercion.
Maybe it's coercion. Yeah, sorry. The coercion of private power as you are of state power. Sorry.
I am. The difference is, though, that private power coercion, without the power of law behind it, is much easier to avoid. A private company can't arrest you. The state can. And so, yeah, absolutely. I am concerned about, the efforts that, the monopoly that Facebook has. I'm concerned about their power. I'm concerned about the effect of Amazon on the market. But I think that the solution to that is the market. The solution is not going to be government, because fundamentally, government doesn't do anything well. The only thing that really government should be trying to do is to preserve individual liberties. I'm concerned about all coercion. And let's be clear, I believe in bad actors. They exist, and it doesn't matter whether they're in government or in private life, or you have a bad neighbor or whatever the thing is. There's always going to be people who are screwing stuff up. The question is, how much power should they have? And if they're in the government, they have a tremendous amount of power. And that's the thing that I worry about the most. But I do worry about everybody using coercion. It's why I want to have a system in which we have as little ability as possible to coerce people to do things, and instead have to rely upon persuasion, even though that's awfully inconvenient.
Well, thanks so much, Dan, for that response. We actually just had 2 super chats come in, so I want to go ahead and push those to the top of the list. Miles Kinslow says, hey guys, which books would best explain each of your philosophies? So we'll start with, Caleb, and we'll move down. What book best summarizes your philosophy, I guess, on these topics?
Well, if you want to understand how our global economy works at this time, you should read Imperialism, the Highest Stage of Capitalism by Vladimir Lenin. That explains how banks dominate over industrial capital, and a small group of bankers based in Western countries rule the world economy and keep the world poor in order to make themselves rich. And I guess I'll give you a shameless plug. I wrote a book called City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, in which I basically laid out my understanding of 21st century socialism and continuing the effort to build a world based on equality and justice. And you should read my book, City Builders and Vandals in Our Age, because it'll give you a perspective that you won't find elsewhere.
All right. Thanks so much. Brenton?
For me, what I would recommend you read, the very first one is Homage to Catalonia by George Orwell. That's like the anarchist book because he was in Spain with the anarcho-communists fighting with them. Well, he was in a Marxist unit, but anyway, I think that book's really great. But like, if you really want to understand where I'm coming from personally, read Calvin and Hobbes. Like, I think that I have been much more influenced by the artists that I've come across necessarily than by the political writers that I have. So the work of Bill Watterson, the work of Thoreau. I've read Walden. I read Civil Disobedience when I was on the Appalachian Trail, if you can, read Snow White Zombie Apocalypse because. It's amazing, if I do say so myself. It's a darn good comic, and it's a lot of fun. So I would say that. I would also say you should look into The Conquest of Bread by Peter Kropotkin. And then there's a great book called Durruti in the Spanish Revolution about my personal hero, Buenaventura Durruti, that's been put out by AK Press. He's a fascinating historical figure and basically the anarchist Che Guevara. So if you want to know about him and his life and what he stood for and what he died for, read Durruti.
All right, awesome. Thanks so much. Dan?
Yeah, so very simple read, and it's online. You can read it for free. iPencil. You can find it at fee.org. Very simple, iPencil. It's a wonderful libertarian book. Economics in One Lesson, also really good. There's actually some really good libertarian fiction. The Heinlein Juveniles, Barnum's Freehold, some of the other books are really good examples of libertarianism in small societies. I would also second Brent's thing of On Walden Pond by Thoreau. I mean, that's just a wonderful book. Civil Disobedience is, I believe, our duty, and an example of everything that I think is right about humanity. Our mission is to be human.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. We've got thanks. So Miles, again, thanks so much for that $5 super chat. We've got a $10 super chat in from Our Father in the Green. Says, why do I often find it that Marxists will dismiss scientific naturalism when it doesn't conform to their narratives, and libertarians when it disrupts profit to take care of communities and the ecology? Shall I read that again, or?
Yes, please. That was a little long.
Okay. Why do I often find it that Marxists will dismiss scientific naturalism when it doesn't conform to their narrative, and libertarians when it disrupts profits to take care of communities and the ecology? Yep, go ahead, Caleb.
Well, I'll say that, the attempt to impose a political agenda onto science, which was done in some socialist countries. It was done in China. It was done in the Soviet Union. It was done elsewhere. That's a mistake. You shouldn't do that, right? Science is science. And when you start imposing a political agenda onto it, that can lead to all kinds of problems. Let me also add that I'm also critical of Marx in some ways. I'm a spiritual person, and Marx was a hard materialist. He believed people were only motivated by their economic circumstances and their direct economic interests. And I believe that people do have a higher spiritual purpose, and that man is not an animal. Human beings can be motivated to act selflessly for a higher purpose. So, in the fact that Marx was just this hard materialist invoking science, that was the flavor of the times. At the time, they were coming out of feudalism and religious freedom was very new, and he saw the church as an oppressive institution, and science was the exciting new way of doing things. But I think we should reconsider some of the things that Marx had to say regarding the issue of science versus spirituality and hard materialism. And on that note, I also don't think we should be, quibbling and trying to impose politics on scientists. Let the scientists do their work.
Sure. Thank you so
if you
much
get
for
a
that.
chance, by the way, and this kind of ties into the books, look into Alan Watts and what he had to say about hard materialism, because it's fascinating and it was mind-blowing for me. So, and that's another author to look into, Alan Watts. He's phenomenal.
Yeah, this is a big this is a big community based around the Great Debate and a lot of those talks. A lot of people know Alan Watt. Dan, did you have something to add to that, or did you want to just move
I was
on?
going to say, I very strongly agree with what Caleb said. human beings are called to a higher purpose. And we recognize that inside of ourselves. That flame is within us. And we are, Washington talked about the danger of parties, but right after that, he talks about the fact that being voluntarily bound to each other is the essence of what we did. We talked about the fact that we are a collective. I agree with that idea as well. I enjoy nothing more than the company of fellow humans and working together. I just don't like being forced to do it.
Sure. Thanks so much for that. So we've got another super chat, and thanks to everybody that hit the like button. Obviously, people do like this because when I said that, hitting the like button helps us understand who likes, if you like this or something different. We went up like 40 likes at that time, so we're up to almost 100 likes now. So, all right. So our next question, we have another super chat from the same person. Our Father in the Green, thank you so much for your $5 super chat. To add, I guess to his last question, to add, thought for the commies. Why are you guys so autistic about material conditions? You seriously think that there are no other large factors in this? I think he meant in this.
Yeah, can I take that one?
Sure, yeah.
Okay. I know what you're trying to say by saying autistic, but just say, why are you so stuck on this? Don't throw autistic people under the bus. But no, to be why leftists focus so heavily on material things, I think, at least from where I'm coming from, people tend to make one of two assumptions: that behavior is biological or that behavior is environmental. And at least from where I'm sitting, I think it's both. But I think that our society, particularly because we are a society that came out of a Protestant Calvinist sects that believed in predestination, they kind of formatted the hard drive of America and large sections of the West. They lean way, way too hard on nature, and they underestimate what comes from nurture. So I think maybe sometimes leftists are trying to push against that tide, and individuals push a little too hard because they may see themselves as a soldier in a larger war, which is silly. I will agree.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Brent. So we'll move on to our next question. We have one from Randolph Richardson. Says, question for all three debaters. So I guess maybe we'll make our responses quick because it'll be for everybody. What percentage of government regulation, e.g. for public safety, is acceptable? A percentage rage is okay, thanks. I think he meant a percentage rate. Like, what do you consider as a percentage of government regulation? He put e.g. for public safety is acceptable.
I kind of reject the premise of the question. That's sort of the problem of how many grains of sand make a pile. What it's going to change depending upon the industry and depending upon the specific circumstances. I think what's acceptable is whatever preserves human life to the best of its ability while still allowing the industry to do the good work that it needs to do. So, for instance, regulating Coke Industries, when they were giving workers cancer and all these OSHA violations, absolutely should be done. Stuff like the credit card industry mandating PCI compliance. A lot of the stuff that they mandate in PCI compliance is absolutely ridiculous and really only serves, like, in an office of 10 people, everyone has to wear name tags just to make sure no one sneaks into the office of 10 people. Mm-hmm. So, just don't be a dick.
All right, thanks so much for that. Caleb, you want to go next?
I'll just say that I believe that the purpose of government is to protect the weak from the strong. And in our society, those who are the strongest are those with the most money, and those of us who are the weakest are those of us who don't have any money. And the job of the government shouldn't be to protect the rich people from the poor, but it should be the opposite. It should be protecting us from those who have wealth and power. Does that mean a lot of rules, a little rules? Does that mean massive government ownership of industry or just restricted and regulated private industry? Whatever is necessary to ensure the economy keeps moving and that we keep going towards that ultimate goal of a stateless, classless world where everyone has what they need.
All right, thanks so much for that. Dan?
My thing of how much government do I think is reasonable regulation? So I live in an area with no police and a volunteer fire department. We do fine. Um, I I don't know how much, but I'm in favor of reducing government by 50% every year. That doesn't mean that we'd ever get to zero government, but we'll get small enough where we can make a decision. Right now, I can't even tell you. Let's just start
Sure.
shrinking it. I just with one thing, I do think that the purpose of government is to protect everybody equally, and a tyrant is a tyrant, even if that tyrant is the majority. Just because 51% of people vote and say that this guy is now our slave, doesn't matter if he's a billionaire, doesn't matter who he is. A tyrant is a tyrant, even if it's the majority.
Well, thanks so much for that, Dan. We're going to move on to our next question. We're going to go into lightning round because we're almost at 2 hours in, which I'm fine with. Originally, I was going to try and cut it short because my bachelor party starts tomorrow, and I'm waking up early to drive. I'm waking up to drive to the mountains in the morning to go snowboarding, and so it's going to be really cool.
Congratulations.
Yeah, thanks.
You're getting married, right? You're
Yeah. So
it's the best.
yeah, so it's really cool. So, but anyway, I thought, you know what? I can pack and do all that stuff after this, so it's cool. I will go for a little while, and but we'll do like a lightning round where we'll start shooting through these. And thanks for your brevity on that one. Sometimes when I'm passionate about something, my friends tell me that I'm long-winded, and I'm like, no, I just like to develop my points in full. There's a difference. So let's move on. We have Jesse Camping again. Question for Dan and Caleb, maybe. It says question. Q Dan dash Caleb. So I think it's maybe correct installing capitalism. Let's see. Caleb, correct installing capitalism due to misunderstanding of currency among many, as I saw in Russia. How can we prevent the corrupt while setting up capitalism?
I'm not sure I understand the
You want me
question.
to try to maybe I'll try and rephrase it. It sounds like he's saying, due to misunderstanding of currency amongst many, as I saw in Russia, how can we prevent or maybe he means corruption, while setting up capitalism? So maybe that's for Dan, because it says,
Yeah, and question.
yeah, I was about to say, because it looks like it's for Dan, but he's saying, Caleb.
It's like, has anybody ever really been to decide look more like? I'm
Yeah.
Let me. I'm just going to answer the question that I want. So here's what I think you're asking. We had talked earlier about the fact that currency is essentially fictional, and fiat currency in particular. One of the things we talked about is that wealth is just your time and your health, and that's it. There's no way to actually accumulate any more wealth. Value is things that have intrinsic value, like land and gold and clean water, things that have value that are not diminished by other people. And currency is our means of exchange. You use your wealth, your health, and your time to acquire things of value. And currency is the means of exchange through which you are able to be compensated for something that somebody doesn't necessarily need, right? If I'm performing a task that you don't need, there's no way that we can actually have trade because I don't have anything that you need unless we have a currency that we agree upon has some sort of value. Now, the problem with corruption is that absolutely you see people who have used currency in manipulative ways. There are, ruthless lenders, people who have taken advantage of the system, using money as a weapon. That is a byproduct of what we do, unfortunately. And there is a very, very old phrase, and a caveat emptor, let the buyer beware. And we have to some extent, recognize the fact that if we give people liberty, we give them liberty to occasionally make bad decisions. And when that happens, the consequences, it shouldn't be your life, but we have a risk associated with everything that we do. And the fact of corruption is one of them. We will never eliminate corruption. I think all of us agree in every governmental system, there will always be corruption.
Yeah, though I think you can eliminate as much of it as possible. Otherwise, it's a nirvana fallacy. But yes, I agree.
All right, perfect. Thank you. So we actually just had another super chat come in from our father in the green, another $5 super chat. Last question for him. Is Bernie the guy to actually reform America and defeat Trump? And will we agree the woke left should never again institutional government power? And then he made a correction in the chat just now. Let me see what it said. Correction to that, gain more power. Okay, so last question, is Bernie the guy to actually reform America and defeat Trump, and will we agree the woke left should never again institutional gain more power?
I think I know what he's trying to say there. So I'm going to do the first question because there's really two questions. All right, so the first question is Bernie the guy? Bernie is probably the best chance that we've ever had. I mean, not really since Eugene v. Debs have we had somebody who had Bernie's values that close to the presidency. And what's really great about Bernie is not so much Bernie himself. And I actually really like Bernie. He's been in the thing for 50 years. He's been fairly consistent, and I trust him more than I can trust any politician, which is not to say that I trust him further than I can throw him. Mm-hmm. What's great about Bernie is he has been bringing together a massive movement of people who have previously not engaged with the system. And he's bringing them out, and they haven't engaged not because they're stupid, not because they don't want to, or they're just lazy. They haven't engaged because the government does not represent the people in the United States of America. And Bernie has given them the hope that they can change that. When Bernie gets in, and I think he will trounce Trump if he goes up against him, if we have a President Sanders, he's not going to save everything because we have this massively corrupt system. But the people that are behind him, the people that are phone banking right now, the people that are knocking on doors, the movement itself, that is something that can shift American politics in a titanic way and break this 50-50 deadlock that we have lived in all of my life and probably all of yours. I mean, you go back and you look, and I'll be very quick here, but the election of Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton. Donald Trump got about 24% of the electorate. Hillary Clinton got about 25%. 51% of people in this country of eligible voters did not vote. And Bernie's goal is to go to that 51% and bring 5%, 10% to the table. And if those people come in and if they take responsibility for themselves and their communities, that's how we defeat climate change. That's how we restrain Wall Street. That's how we build a free and just society. Now, as for the woke left, what I will say is the woke left, I would say there's some hyper woke performative people who are total dicks, and they use leftist language and leftist kind of, oh, I'm so much smarter and better than you, virtue signaling politics to treat people like garbage and to gain power for themselves. Those people are awful. However, that's not everybody, and there are people who genuinely have some serious grievances that we need to listen to and deal with. We could all stand to be more compassionate, and that's what's really important here. The people who approach politics and life from a place that is not a place of compassion, they need to be kept out of power.
All right, thanks so much. We have a super chat just came in from Stripper Liquor. $2 super chat. Thanks so much for your $2 super chat. Question already submitted, but great debate. All right, so they did have a question, and it was a good question. Question for all the panelists. How does the Pareto distribution of wealth work into your governmental and economic viewpoints? Is everybody familiar with the Pareto distribution, or should I give kind of a rundown?
Is it those fancy shoes?
Jordan Peterson and a lot of people use this to kind of talk about how things are distributed. So, like, there's this thing called the Pareto distribution where basically, like, the majority of the top 20% of stars or whatever are grouped in one, in the sky, right? The top 20% of people own the most wealth. The top 20% of almost everything you can think of. It's not just economics. It's all kind of scientific values and things, right? It's the stars, and it's it's you name it. There's all kind of things, even in nature, where the top 20% have the resources and things like that. So I guess what he's asking with that is what do you think about the Pareto distribution? It's typically used in a way to say like, hey, look, this may have some type of evolutionary thing where the cream rises to the top, or the top 20% are like how Bill Gates came up with Microsoft or something like maybe that. I think that's what he's trying to ask, and I could be wrong. Be sure to clarify if I am wrong on that, but I think that's what. Go ahead.
So fundamentally, the way wealth distribution works right now is warped by the government. And we saw a couple great examples of that in the last 12 years. In 2008, if the government had let AIG fail, if it had let the banks fail, you would have seen a tremendous amount of wealth redistribution. The poor wouldn't have lost that much because they didn't have that much to lose, but the wealthy would have lost everything. That would have been awesome. That's what we want to see happen. That's the way things are supposed to go. Fundamentally, though, that level of redistribution only happens when you have a truly free market. When the government protects the wealthy, wealth redistribution never changes. It's why we shouldn't have a powerful government.
All right. Thanks so much for that. Somebody just clarified in the chat that, and I think this is correct, that in regards to economics, I think it's the top 20% own 80% of the wealth. And then so another one is something like, from memory, like the top, like there's 20% of people, like in a group of people who does labor, let's say, there's a 20% margin that does 80% of the labor, right? So I think that kind of rule that governs these things, I think that's what he's trying to get at, is like, maybe there's more to the human involvement than just numbers. But if there's nothing else you guys want to say about that, we can move on. It's fine.
I just want to say that I want to clarify that a lot of the conversation about socialism, capitalism in the United States seems to revolve around redistribution of income. And the redistribution of income happens in every society to some degree or other. I mean, the roads outside my house are paved with tax money from people like me. But socialism is fundamentally not about the redistribution of income. It's about the redistribution of the means of production. It's about the redistribution of the banks, factories, and industry. And it's about control of even the private banks, factories, and industries that exist. And that fundamentally, the goal of any socialist society is to maximize personal income. We want to maximize personal property. We just think that private property, what we refer to as major centers of economic power that are used for no other purpose than making money, those things should be controlled by the state to work in the benefit of all. But ultimately, the goal is for people to have as much prosperity. This notion that, socialists want to raise everyone's taxes and give it to people who are unemployed and make it fair. I learned in school that socialists want everyone to get paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. This is just simply not the nature of reality. It's about control of the means of production, not redistribution of personal income.
All right.
So that will go on. It has
100% right on that.
All right. Thanks so much for that. We did just get a Stripper Liquor did say, Converse Contender, good explanation of the concept. I'm surprised the panel did not know of it because the distribution is partly known economic factor, but thanks. Now, we did just get a...
Can I address that, by the way?
Yeah, go ahead.
Because I actually had something that I wanted to say about that. So I'm not familiar with this. I don't know if it's a factual concept or anything, and I will look into it more after this. But this, I would recommend anybody who follows this type of argument from Jordan Peterson to read Mikhail Bakunin's What is Authority? It's a short essay. You can find it online. It's at like Panarchists. I think Marxist.org also hosts it. And this is really important because when he talks about what is authority, what is authority? Is it, oh Lord, I'm going to mangle this. Essentially, what I'm seeing here is saying, is this 20% a natural law? It's the same thing as, is this hierarchy natural because lobsters? The thing is if something is actually a natural law, we can't actually change it at all. However, we can work within those bounds to make it the best possible. And the fact of the matter is that if 20% is ruling the country right now, and that it's right that 20% should rule the country, well, then what we need to do is to put pressure on that 20% to stop doing it crappy. Because, like, honestly, the people in charge of our society are morons, and they have been running us into the ground for years and years and years. And the fact of the matter is that there are easily better ways to do this. We can distribute the food. We can put the people into the empty houses. So I would say, if it's inevitable, okay, it's inevitable. Let's make it, but let's make it as equitable as possible within that inevitable 20% or whatever it is.
All right, thanks so much for that. And we'll go to our next question. It looks like we've got. Hang on one second. I do have the Pareto distribution pulled up. It was by an engineer, not so Jordan Peterson uses it. Not just him, other people use it. But I can't even start. If you start going down it, it's nothing but formulas. You know it's written by an engineer when the whole thing is just nothing but formulas for like.
And no one has
10
any idea
pages.
what's going on.
Right. But anyway, from what it says, I did it is basically what I said. So anyway, we just had a super chat come in from Luis Romero, 200 MXs. I'm not sure what currency MX is, but I guess maybe Mexican, but I'm not sure. I could be completely wrong about that, but whatever it is, thanks so much for that. 200.
If it's 200 pesos, that's not.
Yeah.
It's not that much.
Right.
Whatever
He's
MX
giving
is. Money away. I'm happy you're throwing anything at all.
Thanks so much for that. Caleb, how did Chinese boom happened without economic special zones that have corporation-friendly laws? And what did Xiaoping meant?
Xiaoping.
What was that?
It means Deng Xiaoping.
Oh, what did Xiaoping meant with "it doesn't matter whether the cat is black or white as long as it catches mice"?
Well, look, the reality is, in China in the 1970s, they were trying to have what they thought was a pure communist society, right? And they argued that you could get to that final goal of a stateless, classless world without raising the level of material abundance. The Gang of Four were Chinese leaders who said you could transition to communism in poverty. And Deng Xiaoping took power and launched the reform and opening up because many Chinese intellectuals, scientists, educated people were being stifled by that Gang of Four system. The way they were running things in the late 60s and early 70s was economically problematic. And Deng Xiaoping said we need to use market mechanisms. We need to have, market zones, but we're going to control them, right? And he made very clear that socialism is superior to capitalism. They needed to maintain 5-year economic plans. But he said poverty is not socialism, but to be rich is glorious, and that they were going to allow a market sector to exist, but control it and utilize it for the benefit of the society overall. And if you look at it, that has been very successful. They were talking about making similar moves in the 80s in the Soviet Union, but the Soviet Union wasn't able to bend, so it broke. China was able to bend and adjust their socialist system. And what they have now is the system they refer to as socialism with Chinese characteristics, where the government controls the major industries and banking and regulates the private sector, and there's kind of an alliance between the government and corporations and the public, and they're all kind of working in the overall interest of economic growth and making a better country overall. And it's different than that old Soviet model where everything is completely state-run. You need a market sector. I mean, I've heard stories from the old Soviet Union about, a doctor, would get paid. Sure, he got paid more than everybody else, but he couldn't spend his money on anything. So he'd have just piles of currency in his house he couldn't do anything with. You obviously need, and North Korea, Cuba, Vietnam have adjusted closer to that Chinese model, and obviously you need a market sector to some degree. I like worker cooperatives, though. In a worker cooperative, not only is it better because no one's exploiting anybody else, but also it's more efficient because instead of getting a wage, every worker is getting a share of the profits they produce. So they're going to work as hard as they possibly can because they want to maximize their share. So I think having worker cooperatives in your private sector is ideal, but you need some kind of market sector in a socialist society. I think in the 90s, China's market sector got a little out of control. And I think President Xi Jinping, he's leading kind of a socialist revival, emphasizing the socialist goals of China to try and stop what kind of got out of control in the 90s. In the 90s, there was a lot of corruption there. People have heard, stories about things that went on in factories that shouldn't have gone on. And they're reasserting the socialist aspect and cracking down on some of the corruption, big crackdown on corruption. It's very fascinating. But let me fundamentally say this, right? I don't want to talk too much about all of that because I'm an American. And when we have socialism here, it's going to be American socialism. It won't be socialism with Chinese characteristics. It won't be Russian communism. It won't be Bolivarianism. We're going to have something that's uniquely American, designed to address our unique circumstances here in this country, overcome historic injustices here, and be based and rooted in the long legacy of progressive and democratic struggles. Karl Marx was an advocate of opposing slavery, a big supporter of Abraham Lincoln. Communists and socialists were key in fighting for women's rights to vote, and that when socialism comes here, it will be a uniquely American socialism designed to serve our own conditions. No one, and I would be the first to oppose applying the Chinese system to America. I'd be the first to oppose applying Soviet communism to America. I want an American form of socialism to address our specific conditions and solve the problems we're facing here in this country with runaway greed and rampant capitalism.
Well,
there's a great essay on that called "If America Should Go Communist" by Leon Trotsky. I'm not like a trot or anything, but it's a good essay. So yeah, read it. It dovetails with what Caleb's saying.
Yeah, I'm just kidding. All right, thanks so much for that. There's interesting feedback. So we actually have we're going to try and get through these last few quickly here. I see a lot of people just came in the room. We've got a huge amount of support for this stream, so they're loving it. And I see a lot of people that just came in. They must have just left another hangout. Please hit that like button and subscribe if you haven't already. We have a $5 super chat from Subtracted, another one of the usual suspects. It says, hey Caleb, do you think there's a way to defeat the bankers and the cooperates who the corporates who run the world? I think it just says corporates.
Probably meant corporations.
Yeah, that run the world.
Popular power. Yes, the people need to be brought into motion. There's a big effort, and always has been on the parts of the elites, to push people out of the political process, make people think politics is too complicated for them, get people to not look into the facts and the reality, but revolutions, and that's the awakening of the public, right? Generally happens in times when there is a crisis, when people are, drawn into the political process. They can't escape it. Politics is everywhere. There are problems that need to be addressed, and the current order cannot address them. And let me emphasize that I am fully in favor of a peaceful transition to socialism. I do not support a violent revolution and would never advocate one. And that genuine revolutionaries have always opposed violent revolutions. That's punchism, that's Blanquism, that's what they call left adventurism. But violent revolutions in history have only happened when the people have tried to organize peacefully and the peaceful means have been cut off. And revolutions that do become violent are acts of great self-defense, where people have no other choice. They're facing attack and onslaught, and they defend themselves. But fundamentally, genuine socialists and Marxists, whether it's, you go back to the Communist Party of the 30s, you go back even further, the Wobblies, Eugene Debs, they always advocated a peaceful democratic transition to socialism. Violent revolutions only happen because the capitalists don't want to allow the democratic process to lead us towards socialism.
All right, thank you much for that.
I'm 150% on board with that as well. I think you need to fight for this to be peaceful until the absolute last moment when you can't do anything else.
All right, let's get Dan in here. We've got a question for Dan from Kilo Doggy 1. It says, Dan, has there ever been a true capitalist society that doesn't have any fake crony capitalist qualities?
Probably the best example, we talked earlier about the Old West, but actually there's a lot of true sub-capitalist societies. And probably the best one is if you look at the way, for those of you who are old enough to remember when drugs were illegal, your local weed guy, he was like the ultimate capitalist, okay? He knew his customers. He knew what you liked. He was important. He wanted to make sure about availability, but he also had competition. He knew that there were other people around selling things. That motivated him to make sure that he checked on you, that he was delivering his service to you. We have a lot of regulations that are in the way at various points in time. There's a lot of cronyism, but there is fundamentally in our society the ability, at least for a little while, to find a way to be of service to society and to get paid for it. Because fundamentally, people only pay you if you provide them a service that they think is valuable. So usually you can find a way to get around regulations. One of the nice things that's happening right now is that technology is outpacing the speed of government because government has become glacially based. And so you look at what happened with Uber. For a long time, Uber was way out ahead of government. Now, government is catching up. I just flew into LAX last weekend, and they have screwed up Uber unbelievably. Uber's not allowed to pick you up at the airport anymore. You have to go to this special station, and you have to walk past 200 cabs with government licenses before you can get onto an Uber. It's really terrible. But there's a whole bunch of other things that are happening where you have the ability to innovate and get paid. And so we have capitalism here, but a lot of times government tries to suppress it.
Thanks so much, Dan. So we got
one sentence very quickly. I agree with Dan that the illegal drug trade is a great example of the reality of unregulated markets.
All right. Well, we got some agreement at least. All right. So I'm going to try and get out of here at the 2 hour and 30-minute mark, which is 13 minutes. So if we can, let's try and get through as many questions as possible with a brief answer. So, and also somebody let me know in the chat that the 200 MX that we received is ironically 200 marks. So we'll move on to the next question though.
German marks?
I have no clue. But
okay.
Next question is Spartan Theology says, does Caleb believe that communism doesn't lead to an even smaller group having control over everything than capitalism?
Well, I think that no socialist society would be in power if there were not a huge, well-mobilized, well-organized population behind them. The Chinese Communist Party has 90 million members, and every section of that country is very, very highly organized. What does Soviet mean, right? That referred to workers' council. As the Bolsheviks were coming to power, they built these community assemblies. You go to the Bolivarian countries, in every neighborhood, they have Bolivarian circles. And the only way socialist countries are able to maintain their socialist system is by constantly bringing people into the political process, a very different reality of our system where they're constantly trying to push us out of the political process. So I think that it leads to empowering people in communities on a national level far more. However, let's be real, right? You know, when you're running countries with millions of people, you're going to have people who are professional politicians. You're going to have bureaucrats. You're going to have people that are going to have more power than others. And the question is, how do you control those people and keep them from just, running off with the money and restoring capitalism? That's a question socialist societies have wrangled with, and that's a fair point to raise.
All right, thank you. We've got 3 more questions, so let's try and get to those. Question: would you outlaw capitalist companies? It seems to me that you could organize yourself in a socialist manner in a capitalist society, coups, but you couldn't vice versa. Brenton?
Oh, yeah, good. I've been meaning to thank you so much for coming up with this, because there were some things said by Dan that were sort of along this lines. I hate this argument. I'm happy you made it, and I'm sure it was made in good faith. Here's the issue. So first off, no, you can't organize yourself in a socialist way in a capitalist society any more than you could organize yourself in a feudal way in a capitalist society. Like, yeah, you could go out, some crazy guy with enough money could go out and build a castle and have people trade plowshares and fealty to him. But that's not a society. That's not an economic system. That's a cult. That's that's role playing. So when we're talking about a socialist society, I'm not talking about a commune or a co-op necessarily. There's some great co-ops. A good example is Mondragon in Spain that functions really, really well within a capitalist market framework. But the fact of the matter is that's not the same thing as a socialist society. That is a cooperatively managed business within a capitalist framework. So one of the big problems with co-ops, for instance, is that capitalism is biased against them. They actually tend to deliver better services and serve both the customer and the community better. What they do not serve better is investors. And capitalism ultimately is a system of monetary speculative investment where what you invest must be paid back in greater and greater numbers in perpetuity. Not every investment, but most of them, because if they don't get paid back, there's an economic crash. And there's huge problems with this. So I do not accept the idea that we can actually live a socialist way in a capitalist thing in anything other than an escapist fantasy or becoming a hermit. And you know what? Honestly, if we get to a socialist society and you want to go and play business owner or CEO on the weekends, you can do that. And it'll be exactly the same thing. But is it really capitalism? No.
All right. Thanks so much for that, Dan. I see you want to interject.
Quick thing about it. Most investments don't pay off. The market is based on the fact that there are failures on investments all the time. That's the important thing about it. If you have a good product and your customers are buying it, you will stay in business.
Right,
yeah, but again, there must be a higher return every time. Capitalism demands infinite growth. I'm not sure the exact percentage of how many investments pay off mathematically to how many that don't, but I do know what happens is when more of them start not paying off, or what happens is you get an economic crash, which is a major reason why capitalism is very volatile, as Caleb pointed out.
All right, thanks so much for that. Next question. We got two more questions. This question is from Oshkosh Bajosh. Converse. I just joined, so I apologize if this topic has already been talked about, but I wanted to ask what each of the guests think about UBI under a VAT system. Is it viable?
Caleb, you want to take that one first?
Well, I think universal basic income shouldn't be necessary. I think in a socialist society, the government would be constantly trying to find a useful job for every citizen to do and unleashing their potential and putting them to work. However, under capitalism, I'm not opposed to universal basic income. It's better than nothing, right? And when we have a system that constantly leaves so many people behind and automation is hanging over us, it would be better than not having it to have UBI. But ultimately, what we need is socialism. That's the real solution. We need the economy to function in a rational way, not according to the chaos of the market.
Yeah, I think that UBI is inevitable to a certain extent because the more our technology improves, the less labor is actually needed. And with regard to like the the situation we've got right now with global warming and environmental destruction, it may be important that people stop working. And that they, suddenly their solemn duty becomes you must enjoy yourself. You must spend your life being a human. So I would say I think UBI in particular, if you combine UBI with universal health care, you'll need universal single payer healthcare, and you need the UBI to be enough for people to live on and not work if they choose to. That would be wonderful for the environment because there's going to be fewer people commuting to bullshit jobs, for one thing. And then two, that is going to completely revitalize middle America because the people in the cities, a lot of them are only there because that's where the work is. So those of us who want to climb the social ladder and play the social game, we stay in the cities, and those of us who just want to live a good, nice life, guess what? You take that UBI and you go and you rent or buy out in the quote unquote flyover states where rent is cheap, and then all of a sudden you've got a huge infusion of money and people and labor to these areas. So I think it's inevitable, but the only way it's going to work is if it actually if people can actually live off of it, and also if they can still get their medical bills paid.
All right, thanks so much for that, Dan. You want to add something quickly?
Yeah, a couple quick things about it. So Milton Friedman actually supported universal basic income. He said that the reason why he supported it is he'd rather see one universal basic income and get rid of all the other government programs that provide welfare, Social Security, et cetera, stuff like that. Get rid of the bureaucracy because there's so much corruption in there. I personally don't have a problem with any form of charity, and I do believe that UBI is a form of charity. The question is, how is it collected? I don't believe in the idea of taking things from people by force, even though it might be for the best of possible circumstances. It's not okay to ethically take something from somebody else to give it to another person. Find a way to do it with persuasion rather than with coercion. People who want to see the closest thing there is to UBI in the United States should check out fairtax.org.
All right, thanks so much for that. And that's interesting. I didn't know that Milton Friedman took that approach to universal basic income, so that's interesting. All right, last question. Kilo Doggy 1. There are places where everyone has a right to housing, but the economy is not strong enough to build houses. How do you get past the hypothetical right to housing with communism?
Well, I think the idea is that under capitalism, houses exist so that landlords and banks can make money from selling them. But in a socialist society, houses exist for the purpose of people living in them. And that's the fundamental difference. A great example of that would be the 2008 financial crisis. The housing bubble burst. Why? Americans couldn't afford to keep buying homes at the same rate they'd been buying them. So Alan Greenspan, desperate to keep people buying homes, legalized all kinds of credit that had previously been illegal in a desperate attempt to keep Americans buying homes. That only worked for a little while, right? And eventually the market crashed because American standard of living has been rapidly decreasing since the 1980s. Deindustrialization, low wages, gradually the standard of living is dropping and Americans just couldn't afford to keep buying homes. And what resulted from that? I know outside of some cities in Nevada and all that, people who had lost their homes across the United States were living in tents. There were tent cities that sprung up across the country after the financial crisis. And what was happening there? People were homeless because there were too many houses. That's capitalism, right? That's only possible in capitalism. In a socialist society, if there's a shortage of housing, there might be people that are homeless, but as long as there's enough housing, people live in those houses. Only in capitalism do you have poverty created by abundance. And that's why you cannot let the market be in command. That's why you need the state to intervene and protect the public.
All right.
I'll jump in on that.
Yes, sir.
So, like, to put that in other terms, because you asked, how do the houses get built? Because capitalism built these houses. Capitalism didn't build those houses. Workers built the houses. Capitalism incentivized the creation of those houses by incentivizing the speculative investment in housing for profit, which is great when you are in a developing stage of economy when you need a bunch of stuff really, really fast. But we're past that. We're at a point where we've got too much stuff. Too many homes have been built. And so we need an economic system where things can slow down. How will houses be built in a communist society? They'll be built by workers. Why will they be built? Because people need somewhere to live. And workers will no longer be tied and need to be paid for their labor because they're getting everything they need from the rest of society. Again, the only reason capitalism is essentially solving a problem that it created in the first place and then saying, give me credit for that. I'm the only one who can possibly do this. No, you're really not. You made it so we had to get paid, and now you're making it so that you have to invest so we get paid. And conveniently, who's in charge? A bunch of capitalists.
Thanks so much, Dan. Did you want to add one last thing before we go? We're at 2 hours and 29 minutes and 59 seconds. So,
the last thing I think is that we should each plug our individual websites. For me, it's lp.org. My name is Dan Fishman. I'm the executive director of the Libertarian Party. We're going to be on every ballot in every state for president. So please consider your third choice options.
lp.org. Thanks. Brenton?
My website is brentonlengel.com. You can Google my name. Google Snow White Zombie Apocalypse Kickstarter. We are more than 60% funded after the first 24 hours. I could really use your support. And honestly, the premiums are incredible, including if you go at the highest level, I will literally take you on the adventure of your lifetime in Iceland. And yeah, you'll be walking through Game of Thrones. So check that out. Help me out. Get this next comic book out.
Caleb?
Hey, CalebMaupin.com, CalebMaupin. But check out my YouTube channel. I'm live every weekend. We have a great time. And you ought to get a copy of my book.
Sounds good. Thanks to everybody for being here. I really appreciate you guys being troopers and sticking it out. And you know, it was a really interesting conversation. I think everybody enjoyed it. We had so many people coming in. It was just a huge crowd, and we had a lot of good feedback and everything. So thanks to everybody in the chat. Thanks for all the super chats. If you haven't already considered following my lead and Brian Stevens and Nathan Thompson and a bunch of other guys and become a patron to the channel, there are a lot of things involved behind the scenes, like you know, paid subscriptions to Zoom and different things like that that a lot of people don't think about. So, you know, consider that if you haven't already. And we appreciate you being here. And with that, keep sifting the reasonable